The sun-bleached Arizona desert holds countless stories, but none burn quite as bright as the siege of Holliday Ranch. When a Mexican cartel decided to expand their territory by forcing out a 73-year-old rancher, they saw Jack Holliday's weathered face and solitary existence and assumed they'd found an easy mark, never suspecting those faded blue eyes had once commanded some of the most classified Special Forces operations in American history. Their fatal miscalculation became apparent when Holliday's call to arms brought 3 fellow veterans to his aid, transforming a peaceful homestead into an expertly engineered kill zone that would become the cartel's most devastating tactical defeat on U.S. soil. Over 48 hours of merciless confrontation, 4 aging warriors eliminated more than 60 elite cartel operatives, seized drugs and equipment worth over $30 million without a single civilian casualty. A perfect operation executed by men society had mistakenly written off, a powerful reminder that some soldiers never lose their edge. They simply find more personal ground to defend. A brief pause before we begin. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from. Do not subscribe to our channel. It's free and you can always change your mind. Enjoy the story. Jack Holliday's weathered hand didn't tremble as he pressed the barrel of the Desert Eagle against Ramon Escobar's forehead. Blood trickled from the cut above Jack's left eye, mixing with sweat as it ran down his leathery face. "You picked the wrong ranch, son," Jack whispered, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent in war zones most Americans couldn't find on a map. Ramon's cocky smile faltered as he looked into the old man's eyes. Those weren't the eyes of a frightened rancher. Those were the eyes of a predator, cold, calculating, and completely void of mercy. "You don't know who you're dealing with, old man," Ramon spat, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his confidence. Jack's lip curled into something resembling a smile. "Funny, I was about to tell you the same thing." Behind them, the desert sunset painted the Arizona sky blood red, as if nature itself anticipated the violence about to unfold. 3 days earlier, the morning sun crept across the floorboards of Jack Holliday's ranch house, dust particles dancing in the golden beams that filtered through faded curtains. Jack sat at his kitchen table, calloused fingers wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, the bitter liquid inside long gone cold. At 73, mornings weren't getting any easier, but old habits die hard. 5:30 hours, same time he'd been waking up for the past 50 years. Outside his window, the Arizona desert stretched toward the horizon, a vast emptiness that most found desolate. Jack found it peaceful. The ranch had been his sanctuary for the past 15 years, ever since he'd hung up his boots after 3 decades with the Special Forces. After Margaret passed 5 years ago, it had become something more, a fortress of solitude where memories were both treasured and feared. He winced as he stood, his left knee protesting with a familiar ache. Shrapnel from Mogadishu, one of many souvenirs from a life spent in service. Jack limped to the sink, dumped the cold coffee, and rinsed the mug. The routine was a comfort, something stable in a world that had always been anything but. The radio on his countertop crackled with the local news. Border tensions, drug busts, political promises that would fade like morning dew. Jack barely listened until a name caught his attention. Posua, the Escobar cartel has expanded operations north of the border, according to federal authorities. 3 ranches in Cochise County have reported suspicious activity. Jack's jaw tightened. Cochise County, his county. The ranches they mentioned were less than 50 miles from his property. He switched off the radio and moved to the window, scanning the horizon with eyes that had lost none of their sharpness despite the years. His property sat on 200 acres of scrubland, the southern edge just 30 miles from the Mexican border. Remote enough to be peaceful, close enough to be valuable to anyone looking to move product north without detection. Jack had chosen it for the isolation. Now that same isolation might make him a target. The distant sound of an approaching vehicle broke his contemplation. A cloud of dust rose from his access road, Sheriff Mike Garza's patrol SUV making its way toward the house. Jack watched it approach, a knot forming in his gut. Mike never came out this far unless there was trouble. He met the sheriff on the porch, screen door slapping shut behind him as he stepped out into the warm morning air. "Morning, Jack," Mike called, climbing out of his vehicle. At 45, the sheriff was no youngster, but next to Jack, he looked like a boy playing dress-up in that uniform. His face was grim despite the casual greeting. "Mike," Jack nodded. "Coffee's cold, but I can make a fresh pot." "No time for that," Mike said, removing his sunglasses. "Though I wouldn't say no to some water. Been driving since dawn. Inside, Jack handed Mike a glass of water and waited. The sheriff had bags under his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that Jack recognized. The look of a man carrying bad news. "The Vasquez place got hit last night," Mike finally said after draining half the glass. "Eduardo and his wife are in the hospital. He tried to fight back when they came to make their offer." Jack's expression didn't change, but a coldness settled in his chest. "The Escobars," Mike nodded. They didn't even try to hide it. Left their mark painted on the barn door. They're sending a message." "What kind of offer?" "Same as the others. Buy the land at a generous price, or they'll take it anyway." Mike set the glass down with a thud. "They're establishing a corridor, Jack. Creating a route they control completely from the border all the way to the interstate. Your place is next in line." Jack absorbed the information silently, his mind already working through implications, options, contingencies. Old instincts, never quite dormant, hummed back to life. "I've got calls in to the DEA and Border Patrol," Mike continued, "but you know how it is. By the time the feds mobilize, these bastards will have moved on. Or worse." Jack walked to the window again, looking out at the land he'd come to love. The garden where Margaret had grown tomatoes and chilies. The oak tree where he'd hung a tire swing for his grandkids' visits. The barn he'd restored with his own hands. "I can have a deputy out here," Mike offered, though they both knew how little that would mean if the cartel decided to move. "No," Jack said quietly. "No need to risk your men." "Damn it, Jack. You can't handle this alone. These aren't some weekend thugs. The Escobars have an army." Jack turned and something in his eyes made Mike fall silent. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The quiet rancher seemed to straighten, his posture shifting from the slight stoop of age to something more dangerous. A predator assessing a threat. "I won't be alone," Jack said, his voice low and steady. "I've got some calls to make too." Mike knew enough about Jack's past to understand what that meant. The sheriff ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking even more tired. "Jack, those days are behind you. You're 73, for Christ's sake. Age is just a number, Mike." Jack's gaze drifted to the wall where a shadow box hung, containing medals and insignia most civilians wouldn't recognize. "Some things you don't forget how to do. At least let me get you out of here until the feds can—" Jack cut him off with a raised hand. "This is my home. I'm not leaving." The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Mike sighed, knowing that stubborn look all too well. "They'll come at night, probably," the sheriff said, accepting defeat. 3, maybe 4 vehicles. 12 to 15 men. Heavily armed. Jack nodded, already mentally cataloging what he'd need. What was still buried in the lockboxes in his cellar? What could be improvised? "I'll check in by phone every 6 hours, Mike said. "You don't answer. I'm coming in with everything I've got." "Fair enough." As the sheriff prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Jack, these men, they're animals. What they did to the Vasquez place—" He shook his head. "Just be careful, old friend." Jack followed him out to the patrol car, squinting against the strengthening sun. "Mike," he called as the sheriff opened his door, "you might want to stay clear of my property for the next couple of days." Mike stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Just leave something for the justice system, will you?" As the sheriff's vehicle disappeared down the dusty road, Jack stood motionless on his porch, feeling the weight of what was coming. Then, with purpose in his step, he went inside and descended the cellar stairs, pulling the chain on a single bulb that illuminated the cool darkness. In the far corner, beneath a workbench covered with gardening supplies, lay a trap door. Jack pushed aside the bench, knelt with a grimace as his knee protested, and lifted the heavy wooden door to reveal a space that hadn't been opened in years. The lockboxes were where he'd left them, secured with combinations only he knew. As he spun the dial on the first one, memories flooded back, not all of them pleasant. The life he'd lived before this one, the skills he'd hoped never to use again. The lid creaked as he opened it, revealing the first set of tools he would need. Lying on top was a satellite phone that hadn't been charged in years. Jack picked it up, feeling its weight in his palm. Some promises were made to be broken. Some brotherhoods transcended time. "Looks like it's time to get the band back together," he murmured to the empty room as he began to dial a number committed to memory long ago. Outside, a hawk circled lazily in the blue sky, riding thermal currents with effortless grace. The desert remained quiet, peaceful. But as Jack waited for the connection, he knew with absolute certainty that the peace wouldn't last. A storm was coming to this quiet corner of Arizona, and Jack Holliday intended to be ready when it broke. The satellite phone rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. "This better be important." It's 5 in the goddamn morning. Rise and shine, Gunny, Jack said, a smile tugging at his lips despite the circumstances. The early bird gets the worm. A beat of silence followed. Then Holiday? Jesus Christ, I thought you were dead. Not yet, though some people might be trying to change that soon. Jack heard rustling on the other end of the line, then the sound of a door closing. When Gunnery Sergeant Frank Bulldog Wilkins spoke again, his voice had lost its sleepy edge. Talk to me, Jack. What's wrong? Remember that retirement plan we always joked about? The one where we'd sit on our porches with shotguns and tell kids to get off our lawns? Yeah. Well, I've got the porch and the shotgun. But instead of kids, I've got the Escobar cartel eyeballing my property. Figure I could use some company. Another pause. Then a low whistle. The Escobars? Shit, Jack. You don't do anything halfway, do you? Never have, Jack replied, shifting the phone to his other ear. Look, Frank, I wouldn't call if… When? Frank cut him off. Soon. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. I can be there in 8 hours. Still at that Dust Bowl in Arizona? Jack felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. 20 years since they'd last worked together, and Frank hadn't hesitated for a second. Same place. Bring whatever toys you've got handy. Always do. And Jack, yeah? I'm calling Preacher and Doc. Don't argue with… Before Jack could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, a mix of emotions stirring in his chest. Relief, certainly, but also a strange sense of anticipation that he hadn't felt in years. The band was getting back together for one last show. Jack spent the next hour inventorying what he had on hand. The Desert Eagle .50 caliber he kept in his bedside drawer. The Remington shotgun above the fireplace. The M14 rifle he'd brought back from Vietnam, modified and maintained meticulously over the decades. 3 handguns of various calibers hidden throughout the house. Plenty of ammunition. From the lockboxes in the cellar, he retrieved items that would have raised eyebrows at any border checkpoint. Ceramic plates for improvised body armor, a night vision monocular that was outdated but functional, a set of tactical radios, and other specialized equipment from his former life. By mid-morning, Jack had spread everything across his kitchen table and was cleaning each piece with practiced precision when his landline rang. Few people had that number. Fewer still would be calling at this hour. Holiday, he answered, wedging the phone between his shoulder and ear as he continued reassembling the M14. Jack, it's Mike. We've got movement on the county road near the Vasquez place. 3 black SUVs, heavily tinted windows. They turn north at the junction. Jack's hands never paused in their work. That puts them about an hour out if they're coming my way. That's my guess. Look, Jack, I've got a patrol car heading to your location, but they're coming from the station. 40 minutes minimum. Tell them not to bother, Mike. My property, my problem. Damn it, Jack! This isn't some bar fight. These men are killers. Jack slid the bolt carrier back into place with a satisfying click. So am I, Mike. Or I was. Some things you don't forget. A frustrated sigh came through the line. At least tell me you've got a plan beyond suicide by Cartel. I've got reinforcements coming, Jack paused. Old friends. Special forces. Christ. I should have known. Mike was quiet for a moment. Just try not to turn my county into a war zone, okay? No promises, Jack replied before hanging up. He looked at his watch. Frank wouldn't be here for hours yet. If the Escobars were already on the move, Jack would need to buy some time. He moved to the window, scanning the horizon. His ranch was situated in a shallow valley, with gentle slopes rising to the east and west, offering decent visibility in all directions. The main house sat back from the access road, with the barn and an old stable forming a rough semicircle around a central yard. Not ideal defensive terrain, but workable. Jack's mind shifted to a different mode, one he hadn't accessed in years, but that came back with unsettling ease. He wasn't Jack Holliday the rancher anymore. He was Captain Holliday, calculating angles of fire, identifying choke points, assessing vulnerabilities. He had maybe an hour. Time to get creative. 40 minutes later, Jack heard the unmistakable sound of engines approaching. He watched from his bedroom window as 3 black Suburbans crawled slowly up his access road, dust billowing behind them. They stopped about 100 yards from the house, just as he'd expected. 5 men emerged from the vehicles. 4 were clearly muscle, thick-necked, tattooed, carrying themselves with the swagger of men accustomed to being feared. The 5th was different, slender, dressed in an expensive-looking suit despite the heat, with the confident posture of someone in charge. They approached the house, spreading out slightly as they walked. Professional. cautious. The suit remained in the center, protected by his men. Jack took a deep breath, collecting himself. Then he stepped out onto his front porch, the Remington held casually in one hand, pointed at the ground. "That's far enough," he called when they were about 20 yards out. The men stopped. The one in the suit, clearly the leader, stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Holliday," he said smoothly, his accent slight but noticeable. "My name is Javier Escobar. I believe we have business to discuss." Jack studied the man. Younger than he'd expected, maybe mid-30s. Handsome in that polished corporate way. Nothing like the cartel thugs portrayed in movies. But his eyes were cold, calculating. "I don't recall making an appointment," Jack replied evenly. Escobar's smile widened. "Consider this a surprise consultation. About your property. Not for sale. Everything is for sale, Mr. Holliday. It's simply a matter of price." Escobar gestured expansively at the ranch around them. "This land, it holds strategic value to my organization. I'm prepared to offer you 3 times its market worth. A generous sum that would allow you to retire quite comfortably anywhere you wish." Jack shifted his weight, feeling the reassuring pressure of the Desert Eagle against the small of his back, hidden under his shirt. "I'm already retired, and I'm already where I wish to be." Escobar's smile faltered slightly. "Perhaps I'm not making myself clear. This isn't truly a negotiation. The land will be ours. The only variable is whether you benefit from the transaction." One of the thugs, a mountain of a man with a teardrop tattoo by his eye, moved his hand subtly toward the bulge under his jacket. Jack noticed but gave no indication. "Let me be clear too," Jack said, his voice hardening. "This land belongs to me. It will stay that way until I'm dead and buried on it. Now I suggest you get back in your fancy SUVs and find somewhere else to run your business." Escobar studied him for a long moment, as if seeing him properly for the first time. "You know who we are, yet you show no fear. Interesting." He tilted his head. "I did my research on you, Mr. Holliday. Former military, living alone since your wife passed. But clearly there's more to your story." "Not much to tell," Jack replied. "Just an old man who wants to be left in peace." "Peace," Escobar repeated as if tasting the word. "A rare commodity these days." He straightened his jacket. "I respect your position, Mr. Holliday. Truly. But business is business. I'll give you 24 hours to reconsider. My associates will return tomorrow for your answer." The threat was clear, hanging in the air between them. Jack said nothing, just held Escobar's gaze steadily. After a moment, Escobar nodded to his men, and they began backing toward their vehicles, never turning their backs on Jack. The message had been delivered. The clock was ticking. As they drove away, Jack remained on the porch until the dust cloud disappeared over the horizon. Then he went inside and picked up the satellite phone. "Frank, it's me. Timeline's accelerated. They just made first contact. We've got until this time tomorrow." "Roger that. We're on our way. ETA 7 hours. They'll be watching the property now. Use the south approach through the wash. I'll mark it for you." "Copy. Stay frosty, old man." Jack hung up and moved to the kitchen window, staring out at his land. The confrontation had gone as expected, but that didn't make the situation any less dangerous. Escobar hadn't shown his full hand yet. The real force would come tomorrow, more men, more weapons, zero patience. The ranch felt suddenly vulnerable, exposed. Every window a potential entry point, every shadow a potential threat. Jack began mentally fortifying the property, identifying what needed to be done before nightfall, before Frank and the others arrived, before the storm hit. He had 24 hours to turn his home into a fortress. And if the Escobars were watching, as he suspected they were, he'd need to be subtle about it. Jack retrieved a toolbox from the garage and set to work, starting with the rear door. To any observer, he would appear to be doing routine maintenance. Only Jack knew he was installing pressure plates that would trigger alarms if breached. Only Jack knew that the seemingly random fence repairs were actually creating fatal funnels that would channel intruders exactly where he wanted them. As the afternoon heat intensified, Jack worked methodically, ignoring the protests of his aging body. The knee ached, the old bullet wound in his shoulder throbbed, but he pushed through it, driven by a clarity of purpose he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about protecting his property. This was about standing his ground, about not being pushed around by men who thought their money and violence gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. By late afternoon, Jack had rigged rudimentary early warning systems around the perimeter of his immediate property. Nothing fancy, just fishing line connected to cans filled with pebbles, positioned where they wouldn't be easily spotted. He'd reinforced doors and windows, positioned weapons at strategic points throughout the house, and prepared fallback positions if the main house was compromised. As the sun began to set, he sat on his porch with a glass of whiskey, watching the golden light fade from the landscape. In the distance, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. Too small for vehicles, just one person on the move. Jack's hand moved instinctively to the Desert Eagle at his side. He watched, muscles tensed as the figure approached. Then his posture relaxed, a smile spreading across his weathered face. The motorcycle that roared up his driveway was as ancient and imposing as its rider. Frank Bulldog Wilkins killed the engine and removed his helmet, revealing a bald head and a silver beard that would make most bikers envious. At 68, Bulldog was 5 years younger than Jack, but looked a decade older. Hard living and harder fighting etched into every line of his face. "You're early," Jack called, raising his glass in greeting. Bulldog spat on the ground and grinned, exposing a gold tooth. "Broke every speed limit from New Mexico to here. Figured you could use the company." The two men embraced briefly but fiercely when Bulldog reached the porch. "Good to see you, you ugly son of a bitch," Jack said, thumping Bulldog's back. "Likewise, you decrepit old bastard." Bulldog pulled back, assessing Jack with narrowed eyes. "You look like shit, by the way." "Still better looking than you." They shared a laugh, the kind that comes easy between men who've seen the worst together and lived to joke about it. But as they entered the house, their demeanor shifted, the brief moment of levity giving way to the gravity of their situation. Bulldog whistled as he surveyed the weapons laid out on the kitchen table. "Just like old times, huh? Except back then, Uncle Sam supplied the hardware." "Speaking of hardware," Jack said, "tell me you brought more than just that antique Harley." Bulldog's grin turned wolfish. He went back to his motorcycle and opened the saddlebags, extracting items that definitely weren't legal for civilian possession. "Retired from the Corps, not from collecting," he explained, laying out an assortment of weapons and equipment that would make a SWAT team envious. "Preacher and Doc are bringing more. They'll be here by midnight." Jack nodded, a sense of calm settling over him. The odds were still against them, but they were improving. 4 old warriors against however many the cartel sent. It wasn't ideal, but they'd faced worse and survived. "So," Bulldog said, accepting the glass of whiskey Jack offered him, "what's the plan? Please tell me we're not just going to sit here and wait for these assholes to roll up." Jack smiled, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Oh, we're going to wait for them, all right. But they won't be finding what they're expecting." He unfolded a hand-drawn map of his property on the table. "They think they're coming to intimidate an old man into selling his ranch," Jack said, his finger tracing routes across the paper. "Instead, they're walking into a kill box designed by 4 of the meanest, most experienced operators Uncle Sam ever unleashed." Bulldog raised his glass. "To teaching the young guns how it's done." They clinked glasses, eyes meeting in silent understanding. Tomorrow would bring violence to this peaceful place. Blood would be spilled. But if Jack Holliday had anything to say about it, it wouldn't be his or his friends. As night fell across the Arizona desert, the 2 old soldiers continued planning, voices low, expressions focused. Outside, the stars emerged one by one, bearing witness to the quiet before the storm. In less than 24 hours, the Escobar cartel would return, expecting to claim what they wanted through intimidation and force. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The night wrapped around Jack's ranch like a protective cloak, the darkness broken only by the brilliant canopy of stars overhead and the soft glow from the kitchen windows. Inside, Jack and Bulldog hunched over the hand-drawn map, their faces illuminated by a single overhead light, casting long shadows across the worn wooden table. "So the main approach is here," Jack said, his finger tracing the dirt road leading to the property. "They'll come in force this time. Multiple vehicles." Bulldog nodded, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "How many men, you figure?" "Based on what the sheriff told me about their other operations, probably 15 to 20. Heavily armed." 4 against 20, Bulldog mused, taking a sip of whiskey. "I like those odds." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Since when?" "Since I realized we're not 25 anymore and can't just charge in guns blazing." Bulldog tapped the map. "We need to work smarter, not harder. Set the battlefield to our advantage." Jack's lips curved into a smile. "I've already started." He outlined the preparations he'd made earlier that day. The early warning systems, the reinforced entry points, the strategically placed weapons caches. Bulldog listened intently, occasionally interjecting with suggestions or questions. "Not bad for a day's work," he said when Jack finished. "But if we're expecting 20 tangos, we need more deterrence. Something to thin the herd before they even reach the house." Jack rose from his chair with a slight wince, his knee protesting the movement. I've got some ideas about that. Come on! He led Bulldog to the cellar, flipping on the light to reveal stacks of storage boxes, tools hanging on the walls, and a workbench cluttered with gardening supplies. In the corner sat the open trap door, exposing the hidden compartment beneath. Jesus, Jack, Bulldog muttered as they descended into the secret room. You've been holding out on me. The space was larger than it appeared from above, extending under a portion of the cellar floor. Metal shelving lined the walls, each shelf loaded with equipment that wouldn't look out of place in a military armory. Jack moved to a dusty footlocker in the corner and knelt before it, spinning the combination lock with practiced ease. Margaret never knew about this place, he said quietly as he worked the lock. Told her it was just extra storage for garden tools. She knew, Bulldog said with certainty. Women always know? Jack paused, considering this. Yeah. Pintillo, you're probably right. He lifted the lid of the footlocker. She just loved me enough not to ask. Inside the locker lay an assortment of items wrapped in oilcloth. Jack carefully unwrapped one, revealing a metal canister the size of a soup can. M18A1, he said, holding it up for Bulldog to see. Claymore mines. I've got 6, Bulldog let out a low whistle. Damn, Jack. The ATF would have a field day with you. What the government doesn't know won't hurt them, Jack replied with a shrug. I've also got some dat cord, blasting caps, and enough C4 to make things interesting. All this time, I thought you were growing tomatoes and playing shuffleboard, Bulldog said, shaking his head in admiration. Meanwhile, you're sitting on an arsenal that would make a third-world dictator jealous. Just because I retired doesn't mean I got stupid. This close to the border, you need to be prepared. Jack rewrapped the mine and closed the locker. These will help even the odds, but we'll need to be strategic about placement. Back upstairs, they resumed planning, now incorporating the explosives into their defensive strategy. They were deep in discussion when the sound of an approaching vehicle caught their attention. Both men reacted instantly, muscle memory from decades of combat situations taking over. Jack moved to the window while Bulldog retrieved his sidearm from the table. Single headlight, Jack reported, peering through a gap in the curtains. Motorcycle. Could be Doc. They waited in tense silence as the motorcycle pulled up to the house and its rider dismounted. Jack's posture relaxed as he recognized the tall, lean figure approaching the porch. It's him, he confirmed, heading for the door. Dr. Marcus Doc Williams had been the medic for their unit, a role that belied his exceptional combat skills. Now 65, he remained as imposing as ever, standing well over 6 feet with broad shoulders and hands that could either heal or harm with equal proficiency. His close-cropped hair had gone completely silver, contrasting sharply with his dark skin. Doc, Jack greeted him warmly as he stepped onto the porch. Captain, Doc replied with a nod, his deep voice as steady and reassuring as Jack remembered. They clasped hands firmly, years falling away in an instant. Doc's eyes scanned Jack critically, the assessment of a medical professional. You look like hell. So I've been told, Jack chuckled. Bulldog give you that diagnosis? Doc asked as he entered the house. Who else? The reunion between Doc and Bulldog was equally warm, a brief bear hug followed by the good-natured insults that passed for affection among men of their generation. Still ugly as sin, I see, Doc remarked, eyeing Bulldog's wild beard. Still a pretty boy, Bulldog retorted. Even with all that gray. Doc set his duffel bag on the floor and surveyed the weapons and maps spread across the kitchen table. I see the party's already started. Just the preliminary planning phase, Jack said, pouring Doc a finger of whiskey. Glad you could make it. Doc accepted the drink but didn't immediately take a sip. Wouldn't miss it. When your old CO calls for help, you answer. He looked at Jack intently. Though I gotta say, taking on a cartel wasn't what I had in mind for my golden years. Should have retired to Florida like I suggested, Bulldog quipped. And miss all this? Doc gestured around them. Besides, someone's gotta patch you 2 idiots up when you get yourself shot. Speaking of idiots, Jack said. Any word from Preacher? Doc nodded. He's about 3 hours behind me. Had to make a detour to pick up some specialized equipment, whatever that means. With Preacher, it could mean anything from holy water to a rocket launcher, Bulldog said with a snort. The 3 veterans shared a knowing laugh. Thomas Preacher McCallum had been the explosives expert in their unit, earning his nickname not from any religious zeal, but from his tendency to quote scripture right before detonating charges that sent enemies to meet their maker. Doc opened his duffel bag and began extracting its contents. a compact medical kit that would put most emergency rooms to shame, a disassembled sniper rifle that he expertly began putting together on the spot, and various other tools of their former trade. "So," he said as he worked, "what exactly are we up against?" Jack filled him in on the Escobar cartel's activities in the region, their interest in his property, and the confrontation earlier that day. "They gave you 24 hours, Doc summarized when Jack finished. "Generous of them." "They're not being generous," Jack replied. "They're being cautious." Something about our little chat made Escobar think twice about moving immediately. He recognized a predator when he saw one, Bulldog suggested. Doc nodded in agreement. "These cartel boys are used to pushing around civilians and corrupt officials. They probably don't run into many Special Forces vets." "Either way," Jack continued, "they'll be back tomorrow with more men and less patience. We need to be ready." They returned to the planning, now incorporating Doc's skills and input. As a former sniper, he would provide overwatch from the barn's hayloft, which offered clear lines of sight to the main approach and surrounding areas. Jack and Bulldog would coordinate the ground defense, with various fallback positions identified throughout the property. "We should place the claymores here, here, and here," Bulldog suggested, marking spots on the map. "Remote detonation so we control when they go boom. And we'll need some distractions," Doc added. "Something to divide their attention and break up any coordinated assault." Jack nodded thoughtfully. "I've got some fuel barrels in the equipment shed. Properly rigged, they could create quite a diversion." As they refined their strategy, the atmosphere in the kitchen took on a familiar intensity. Despite the years that had passed, despite their aging bodies and gray hair, these men fell seamlessly back into the roles they had perfected decades ago. The planning, the anticipation, the calculated risk assessment, it was like muscle memory, never truly forgotten. Around midnight, the distant rumble of an engine announced another arrival. This time, Jack didn't bother checking the window. He knew who it was. Preacher's entrance was typically dramatic, the door swinging open without a knock, his lean frame silhouetted in the doorway, a battered cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes. "Heard there was a reunion," he drawled, his Texas accent thick as molasses. "Didn't want to miss the fun." At 66, Thomas McCallum was the youngest of the group, though the hard years had left their mark in the deep lines around his eyes and the slight stoop to his once ramrod straight posture. A thick mustache dominated his face, dropping down past his chin in an old-fashioned style that somehow suited him perfectly. Greetings were exchanged, whiskey poured, embraces shared. The four men stood in Jack's kitchen, a circle of weathered warriors, the bonds forged in combat decades ago still strong and vital. "Well," Preacher said, raising his glass, "here's to old dogs and one last hunt." They drank solemnly, each man aware that the coming confrontation might be their final battle. But there was no fear in the room, only determination and a quiet confidence born of experience. Preacher set down his glass and rubbed his hands together eagerly. "Now show me what we're working with. I brought some toys that might come in handy." He disappeared outside briefly, returning with a large duffel bag that clinked suspiciously as he set it on the floor. From it, he began extracting an assortment of devices, some clearly homemade, others modified from commercially available products. "Motion sensors," he explained, holding up a small electronic device. "Military grade, but with my own improvements. Silent alert system that'll transmit to these." He produced 4 earpieces. "We'll know exactly where they are, even in the dark." Jack raised an eyebrow, impressed. "You've been keeping busy in retirement." "Hobby shop in my garage," Preacher confirmed with a grin. "Drives my wife crazy, but keeps me out of the bars." He continued unpacking. Specialized ammunition, night vision equipment newer than what Jack had in his cellar, and a tablet computer loaded with what he described as proprietary software for coordinating their defensive efforts. "Where'd you get all this?" Bulldog asked, examining one of the motion sensors. Preacher's eyes twinkled mischievously. "Let's just say I've maintained certain professional relationships over the years. Some folks in the government still appreciate the old-school approach to problem solving." Jack didn't press for details. In their world, some questions were better left unasked. What mattered was that they now had equipment that significantly improved their odds. With Preacher's contributions integrated into their plan, the 4 men moved outside to begin setting up their defenses. The night air was cool and still, the silence broken only by the occasional call of a coyote in the distance. They worked with quiet efficiency, communicating in the shorthand of men who had operated together for years. Jack and Bulldog placed the claymore mines at strategic choke points along the likely approach routes, carefully concealing them among the desert vegetation. Doc set up his sniper's nest in the barn loft, establishing clear fields of fire and marking distances to key landmarks for range estimation. Preacher installed his motion sensors in a wide perimeter around the property, then helped Jack rig the fuel barrels with remote detonators. By 3 in the morning, the initial preparations were complete. They gathered on Jack's porch, taking a brief rest before the final phase. "Just like old times," Doc commented, leaning against the railing. "Except my back hurts more now." "Everything hurts more now," Bulldog grumbled, rolling his shoulder to ease some unseen ache. Preacher chuckled. "Remember that operation in Honduras? 3 days in the jungle with no sleep, tracking that arms dealer?" "Santiago," Jack nodded, the name coming back to him instantly. "Slippery bastard." "Not so slippery after Doc put a round through his engine block from 800 meters, Bulldog recalled. Doc shrugged modestly. "Had a good spotter." They continued reminiscing, sharing stories from their years of service, some humorous, others harrowing, all bound by the common thread of brotherhood. As they talked, the tension of the coming confrontation seemed to ease slightly, replaced by a calm confidence that came from knowing exactly who stood beside you when the bullets started flying. Eventually, Jack called them back to the task at hand. "We've got about 3 hours until dawn. Let's finish setting up and get some rest while we can. They probably won't make their move until late morning, but we need to be ready earlier." Inside, they made final adjustments to their plan. Assignments were confirmed, contingencies established, emergency protocols agreed upon. Then Jack distributed the weapons, each man receiving a primary and secondary firearm suited to their role in the defense, along with extra ammunition and communications equipment. "One last thing," Jack said when they were finished. He disappeared into his bedroom briefly, returning with a small wooden box. From it, he removed 4 tarnished coins, Special Forces challenge coins from their unit. "Kept these all these years," he said, handing one to each man. "Figured they might bring us luck." The gesture landed heavily in the room. These weren't just mementos. They were tangible connections to a shared past, to the men they had been and, in many ways, still were. Doc examined his coin, rubbing his thumb over the worn emblem. "To the fallen," he said quietly. "To the fallen," the others echoed, each man momentarily lost in memories of comrades who hadn't made it home. After a moment of silence, Jack spoke again. "Get some sleep if you can. I'll take first watch." "Like hell you will," Bulldog objected. "You've been up longest. I'll take first watch, then Preacher, then Doc." "You sleep until we need you?" Jack started to protest, but the look in Bulldog's eyes stopped him. It wasn't just about logical rotation of duties. It was about taking care of their leader, ensuring he was at his best when the moment came. "Fine," Jack conceded. "Wake me in 2 hours." He retreated to his bedroom, leaving the others to sort out the watch schedule. Despite his exhaustion, sleep didn't come easily. Jack lay on his bed, fully clothed except for his boots, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced with thoughts of the coming confrontation, mentally reviewing their preparations, identifying potential weaknesses, considering alternatives. It had been decades since he'd last commanded men in combat. The responsibility weighed on him, a familiar burden that he'd once carried daily but had since set aside. Now, picking it up again, he found it both heavier and somehow comforting in its familiarity. Jack thought of Margaret. What would she think of all this? Her peaceful home transformed into a fortress, her garden about to become a battlefield. She had always understood him, had known when they married that she was binding herself to a warrior. But she had also been the one to help him find peace, to show him that there was life beyond the constant vigilance and violence of his profession. "Just one more mission, Margaret," he whispered to the empty room. "Then I'll go back to being the man you helped me become." Eventually, fatigue overcame his racing thoughts, and Jack slipped into a light soldier's sleep, alert even in rest, ready to spring into action at the slightest provocation. When Preacher woke him 2 hours later, Jack rose immediately, his body protesting, but his mind clear. He joined the others in the kitchen for a pre-dawn meal. Coffee, cold sandwiches, and a shared silence that spoke volumes about the day ahead. As the first hints of light appeared on the eastern horizon, they moved to their positions. Doc climbed to his sniper's nest in the barn loft, setting up his rifle and establishing communication with the others through the earpieces Preacher had provided. Bulldog took position in an improvised bunker they'd created behind the woodpile, which offered cover and a clear view of the main approach. Preacher settled into the stable, surrounded by his electronic equipment, ready to coordinate their response when the attack came. Jack returned to the house, positioning himself at the kitchen window with a clear view of the yard. He checked his weapons one last time, then settled in to wait. The rising sun painted the desert in shades of gold and amber, the beauty of the scene at odds with the violence it would soon witness. Jack watched a family of quail make their way across his yard, the mother leading her chicks in a neat line toward the safety of a scrub bush. Movement on the county road. Doc's voice came through the earpiece, calm and professional. Dust cloud approaching from the south. Multiple vehicles. Copy that, Jack replied. Everyone stand by. Let them make the first move. He felt a familiar calm settle over him, the focused readiness that had kept him alive through countless operations. His hand rested easily on the M14, his breathing steady and controlled. The quail disappeared into the brush, seeking shelter from the coming storm. The hunters were approaching. But today, they would find themselves the hunted. The convoy of black SUVs crawled up the dusty access road like a funeral procession, their tinted windows revealing nothing of the men inside. Through his earpiece, Jack heard Doc counting vehicles from his vantage point in the barn loft. 5 vehicles total. 4 Suburbans, 1 Range Rover in the center. The Range Rover will be Escobar. Copy that, Jack responded, his voice barely above a whisper, despite being alone in the house. Everyone hold positions. Let them come to us. The vehicles formed a semicircle about 50 yards from the house, engines idling, dust settling around them in the morning light. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then doors began opening simultaneously, men emerging with military precision that Jack hadn't expected. I count 18 tangos, Doc reported. All armed, rifles mostly, some sidearms visible. They're wearing tactical vests. Jack watched through narrowed eyes as the men spread out in a practiced formation. These weren't ordinary cartel thugs. They moved with the discipline and awareness of trained operators. Preacher, Jack said into his comm, are you seeing this? Roger that, came the reply. These boys have had training. Military or police background, I'd wager. Mercenaries, Bulldog added. Cartel's been recruiting ex-military from all over South America. Some U.S. washouts too. The information changed the calculus. Jack had expected violent but undisciplined cartel soldiers, not professionals who understood tactics and teamwork. He watched as they established a perimeter, 2 men staying with each vehicle while the others formed a protective cordon around one central figure. Javier Escobar, stepping out of the Range Rover in another impeccably tailored suit, seemingly unconcerned by the desert heat. Showtime, Jack muttered, moving away from the window and positioning himself behind the reinforced front door. He hefted the M14, checking the chamber one last time before calling out through the door. That's close enough, Escobar. Outside, the advancing men paused. Escobar stepped forward, flanked by 4 guards who scanned the property continuously, their weapons at the ready. Mr. Holliday, Escobar called, his voice carrying across the yard. I've come as promised to hear your decision. I trust you've had time to reconsider my generous offer? Jack didn't immediately respond. Through his earpiece, Doc provided ongoing surveillance. They've got men moving to the east and west, trying to flank the house. 2 headed toward the barn. See them, Jack confirmed. Bulldog, Preacher, hold positions. Doc, you're about to have company. 2 tangos approaching your location. Copy that, Doc replied calmly. I see them. Outside, Escobar was growing impatient. Mr. Holliday, I'm a businessman. I prefer to resolve this amicably, but my patience has limits. Jack finally opened the door a crack, keeping most of his body shielded behind it. My answer's the same as yesterday, Escobar. This land's not for sale. Not to you, not to anyone. Even from a distance, Jack could see Escobar's expression harden. The cartel leader adjusted his cuffs, a gesture that seemed oddly formal given the circumstances. I see. That's disappointing. Escobar turned to one of his men and said something in rapid Spanish. The man nodded and began relaying orders through a radio. They're coordinating, Preacher warned through the comm. Perimeter team is tightening. Motion sensors picking up movement on all sides now. Jack had expected this. The show of force, the intimidation tactics. What he hadn't expected was the level of discipline these men displayed. They weren't just thugs with guns. They were executing a textbook envelopment of his position. Mr. Holliday, Escobar called out again. Perhaps you don't fully grasp the situation. You are one old man. I have brought enough men to overwhelm a small police force. He gestured expansively around him. There's no need for violence. Sign the papers, take the money, and walk away with your dignity intact. Jack felt a surge of cold anger. You talk about dignity, but you're nothing but a thief with an expensive suit. You don't take what isn't yours. Not while I'm still breathing, Escobar sighed dramatically. As you wish. He raised his hand and his men instantly tensed, weapons raising. Doc, Jack said quietly into his comm. The two men approaching the barn. Take them. Roger that, came the calm reply. Two sharp cracks echoed across the property, so close together they almost sounded like a single shot. The men advancing on the barn crumpled simultaneously, neat holes appearing in their foreheads. Chaos erupted. Escobar's men dove for cover, shouting in Spanish and English, trying to locate the shooter. Escobar himself was tackled to the ground by his bodyguards, hustled back toward the Range Rover. Sniper! Someone shouted. Jack used the confusion to slam the door shut and move swiftly to his fallback position at the kitchen window. Through his earpiece, he heard Bulldog's rough laughter. Oh, for first blood to Doc. Nice shooting, you old sawbones. Just warming up, Doc replied coolly. Outside, the cartel forces regrouped with surprising speed. 3 men established covering fire toward the barn, while others began advancing on the house in bounds. One group moving forward, while another provided cover, then leapfrogging ahead. Professional tactics. They're making a serious push to the house, Preacher reported. Want me to light up the welcome mat? Jack hesitated only briefly. Do it. A moment later, the first Claymore mine detonated with a thunderous boom, sending deadly steel balls scything through the air in a directed fan. Screams cut through the ringing silence that followed. Men down in the dirt, some moving, some terribly still. The survivors scrambled backward, abandoning their advance in favor of safer positions behind their vehicles. Jack used the opportunity to assess the situation. Through the swirling dust, he counted 3 men down from the Claymore, at least one certainly dead. Combined with Doc's 2 kills, that reduced Escobar's force to 13 operators. Still bad odds, but improving. Bulldog, Preacher, shift to Phase 2, Jack ordered. Doc, maintain overwatch and take targets of opportunity. Priority on anyone who looks like they're giving orders. Copy that, came the unified response. Phase 2 of their plan involved creating multiple threats to divide the attackers' attention. Jack watched through the window as Bulldog opened fire from his position behind the woodpile, forcing 2 cartel men to take cover behind a Suburban. Simultaneously, Preacher triggered a small explosive charge in the equipment shed on the far side of the property, not designed to kill, just to create noise and confusion. The strategy worked. Escobar's men, now facing fire from 3 directions, split their focus. Some returned fire toward Bulldog's position, others toward the barn where Doc continued to take precise shots when opportunities presented, and still others moved to investigate the explosion at the equipment shed. Jack keyed his comm. Preacher, how many headed your way? 3 tangos approaching the shed, armed with assault rifles, moving cautiously. Can you handle them? Does the Pope wear a funny hat? Jack smiled despite the gravity of the situation. Just checking. Across the yard, Jack spotted Escobar huddled behind the Range Rover, surrounded by 4 bodyguards. The cartel leader was shouting into a radio, clearly frustrated by the unexpected resistance. Doc's voice came through the comm. Jack, we've got a problem. 2 vehicles approaching from the south. Fast, Jack cursed under his breath. Reinforcements already. He hadn't expected Escobar to have a quick reaction force stationed nearby. Bulldog, shift fire to cover the southern approach. Doc, can you delay them? I can try to discourage them, Doc replied. Moments later, the crack of his sniper rifle echoed again. In the distance, Jack heard the squeal of tires, followed by the sound of a vehicle swerving off the road. Hit the lead vehicle's engine block, Doc reported. They're stopped, taking cover behind their trucks. About 6 men, similar gear to our current friends. The odds were shifting again, not in their favor. 24 hours, Jack had told Sheriff Mike. 24 hours before he needed to worry. But the situation was escalating faster than anticipated. Jack made a quick decision. Preacher, time for the fireworks. Let's make it hot for these gentlemen. Music to my ears, Preacher responded with audible glee. 30 seconds later, the fuel barrels they'd rigged near the edge of the property detonated in sequence, creating a wall of fire between the main force and their reinforcements. The explosions were followed by secondary detonations as the ammunition in one of the Suburbans, parked too close to the blast, began cooking off. The yard had transformed into a war zone, burning vehicles, the pop of small arms fire, shouted commands in Spanish, and the acrid smell of cordite filling the air. Jack used the confusion to move to the front of the house, positioning himself to engage targets attempting to advance under cover of the smoke. His earpiece crackled with Preacher's voice. Scratch 3 tangos at the equipment shed. They walked right into my little surprise. There was a pause. Taking fire now. Pretty heavy. Moving to secondary position. Roger that, Jack replied. Bulldog status? Having a ball, came the gruff response, punctuated by the sound of gunfire. I put a 2 down over here. Got one trying to flank me on the west side. Jack swung his rifle in that direction, spotting a man in tactical gear, attempting to circle around Bulldog's position. Jack took a breath, steadied his aim, and squeezed the trigger. The M14 bucked against his shoulder, and the flanking attacker went down hard. Thanks for the assist, boss, Bulldog said. Like old times, Jack replied, already shifting his attention back to the main group. The initial exchange of fire had lasted less than 10 minutes, but already the battlefield had changed dramatically. 7 of Escobar's original force were down, with an unknown number of the reinforcements neutralized or delayed by the fire and Doc's sharpshooting. But the advantage of surprise was waning, and the remaining cartel forces were adapting to the situation, establishing more disciplined fire teams and seeking better cover. Jack spotted a man setting up what looked like a light machine gun behind one of the Suburbans, a weapon that could pin them down and shift the balance of the engagement. Doc, Jack said urgently. Gunner setting up behind the second vehicle from the left. Priority target. I see him, Doc replied. Wind's tricky. Give me a sec. The seconds stretched painfully as the gunner finished mounting his weapon. Just as he began to swing the barrel toward Bulldog's position, Doc's rifle cracked once more. The gunner slumped over his weapon, motionless. Target down, Doc confirmed. Jack allowed himself a moment of relief before returning to the rapidly evolving situation. The reinforcements had begun to move around the wall of fire, attempting to flank from the south. Meanwhile, Escobar had regrouped his remaining men near the vehicles, establishing a defensive perimeter while seemingly planning their next move. They're switching to defensive posture, Jack observed over the comm. Regrouping. Good, Bulldog replied between bursts of gunfire. Let's keep them reactive. Preacher, you got any more surprises ready? Always, came the cheerful response. Say the word. Jack considered the situation. The initial exchange had gone better than expected, but they were still outnumbered and potentially outgunned if Escobar had more reinforcements on the way. They needed to maintain pressure without exposing themselves too much. Preacher, target the vehicles. Let's reduce their mobility. With pleasure. Moments later, small explosive charges that Preacher had placed during the night detonated beneath 2 of the Suburbans, not powerful enough to destroy them completely, but sufficient to rupture fuel tanks and flatten tires. Black smoke billowed into the morning sky as the vehicles began to burn. Jack couldn't help but smile grimly. The cartel had come expecting to intimidate a lone old man. Instead, they'd walked into a carefully orchestrated ambush by career professionals. But he knew better than to get overconfident. The hardest part was yet to come. Through the smoke, Jack saw Escobar gesturing angrily at his men, clearly displeased with how the situation was unfolding. The cartel leader was still surrounded by his personal security detail, keeping him well protected. Doc, any shot at Escobar? Jack asked. Negative. Too well covered. I'd have to hit 2 men to get to him. Hold position then. Keep pressure on the reinforcements. The firefight settled into a rhythm of sorts. Sporadic exchanges of gunfire, neither side willing to commit to a full assault, each probing for weaknesses. It was a stalemate, but one that favored Jack and his team. Every minute that passed was another minute for Sheriff Mike to hear the gunfire and call in proper reinforcements. Then suddenly the cartel forces ceased fire. A strange silence fell over the property, broken only by the crackling of burning vehicles. What are they up to? Bulldog muttered over the comm. As if in answer, a new voice called out from behind the Range Rover. Holliday, this is no longer about business. You've killed my men. It was Escobar, his cultured tone now edged with rage. I'm going to burn this place to the ground with you in it. Jack didn't respond, watching carefully as the cartel forces began to move again, this time with more purpose. They were spreading out, establishing a wider perimeter. I don't like this, Preacher said over the comm. They're up to something. Doc, any movement from the reinforcements? Jack asked. They're holding position. Wait, they're unloading something from the truck. Looks like... Doc paused. Shit. They've got a launcher of some kind. RPG, maybe. Jack's stomach dropped. An RPG would change the equation dramatically, potentially destroying their defensive positions with a single shot. Can you take the shooter? Trying to get an angle. He's keeping the truck between us. Jack made a quick decision. Bulldog, I need you to relocate to the south side of the house. Cover Doc while he deals with that RPG. Preacher, Time for the grand finale. All remaining charges on my mark. Roger that, both men confirmed. Jack watched the cartel forces continuing to maneuver, trying to discern their strategy. They seemed to be setting up for a coordinated assault, probably timed to coincide with the RPG strike. He needed to disrupt their plan before it could fully form. Preacher, execute. Fire in the hole! The remaining claymores and improvised explosives detonated in rapid succession, creating a chaotic pattern of destruction across the battlefield. Men scrambled for cover as dirt, smoke, and debris filled the air. In the confusion, Bulldog darted from his position to the south side of the house, firing short bursts as he moved to keep heads down. Doc's rifle cracked once, twice, 3 times in quick succession. RPG team down, he reported, satisfaction evident in his voice. 3 targets neutralized. Before Jack could acknowledge the success, a new threat emerged. Through the settling dust, he spotted 3 men sprinting toward the house, carrying what looked like breaching charges. Contact front, Jack shouted into his comm. Breachers approaching the house. He swung his rifle toward the approaching men, squeezing off 2 rapid shots. 1 man went down, but the others continued their advance, zigzagging to present difficult targets. Jack adjusted his aim, tracking the lead man. But before he could fire again, Bulldog's voice rang in his ear. I got him! A burst of automatic fire tore through the yard, catching the remaining breachers in the open. They fell like marionettes with cut strings, the breaching charges tumbling from lifeless hands. Nice shooting, Jack said, already scanning for the next threat. He didn't have to wait long. From behind the burning Suburbans, cartel gunmen opened up with concentrated fire, peppering the house with bullets. Windows shattered, wood splintered, and Jack was forced to duck below the windowsill as rounds tore through the space where his head had been moments before. They're getting desperate, Preacher observed. Burning through ammo like they've got an unlimited supply. Suppressive fire, Jack replied. See, they're going to try something. Doc, you got eyes on Escobar? Negative. Lost him in the smoke. Wait, movement at the Range Rover. They're backing it up. I think they're preparing to leave. Jack processed this information quickly. If Escobar was retreating, it either meant he was giving up or, more likely, planning something worse. He's not the type to walk away from a fight, Jack said. Something's not right. As if confirming his suspicion, the intensity of fire suddenly increased, rounds coming from new angles, forcing all 4 defenders to keep their heads down. They've got us pinned, Bulldog growled. Can't get a shot off without eating lead. Jack was formulating a response when a new sound cut through the gunfire. The distinctive whump, whump, whump of helicopter rotors approaching fast. Helicopter incoming, Doc called urgently. Coming in low from the southeast. Cartel air support? Preacher asked, disbelief evident in his voice. Jack moved to the rear window of the house, peering out carefully. Through the smoke and dust, he caught glimpses of a black helicopter approaching rapidly, flying dangerously low to the ground. Mexican cartels have been known to use helicopters, he said grimly, but not usually this far north. The helicopter appeared through the smoke, a sleek black shape with no visible markings. It hovered momentarily on the southern edge of the property before settling into a landing zone, well away from the firefight. Can anyone get a clear shot? Jack asked. Negative, Doc replied. Too much smoke, and they're staying out of my line of sight. Smart pilot. Jack watched as the helicopter's door slid open and several figures emerged. They were too distant to identify clearly, but their movements suggested military training, disciplined, purposeful, alert to their surroundings. Reinforcements, Jack muttered. Just what we needed. The battle had been going reasonably well. They'd inflicted significant casualties while sustaining none themselves. But if Escobar had brought in a team of elite mercenaries, the balance could shift rapidly. Preacher, any more surprises left? Jack asked. Fresh out of boom boom, Captain. Down to bullets and bad language. Jack considered their options. They could try to withdraw to a more defensible position, perhaps the root cellar beneath the barn, which offered only one entry point. But retreating now would surrender the initiative completely. We hold, he decided. Doc, focus on any new arrivals that present targets. Bulldog, conserve ammo, but keep their heads down. Preacher, circle back to the house if you can do it safely. As Jack issued these orders, he noticed a change in the pattern of fire from the cartel forces. Their shots were becoming more sporadic, less coordinated. Through his window, he could see some of them glancing repeatedly toward the helicopter landing zone, as if waiting for instructions. Then abruptly, the firing stopped altogether. In the sudden silence, a voice called out from behind the burned-out vehicles. "Holliday! Can you hear me?" It was Escobar. "I hear you," Jack called back, keeping his rifle trained on the source of the voice. "Perhaps we should discuss terms," Escobar shouted. "Dari, this has become unnecessarily costly." Jack exchanged confused glances with Bulldog, who had made his way back to the house during the lull. "What's his game?" Bulldog whispered. Jack shook his head, equally puzzled. "Not sure. Keep sharp." To Escobar, he called, "Nothing to discuss. You leave my property, that's the only term." A harsh laugh floated across the yard. "You misunderstand, Mr. Holliday. I'm not surrendering. I'm offering you one last chance to surrender." As Escobar spoke, Jack caught movement at the edge of his vision, figures approaching from the direction of the helicopter, moving with tactical precision through the smoke. "Company coming," Jack warned over the comm. "Unknown number approaching from the south." "I see them," Doc replied. "Five of them." "No, 6 individuals. Well armed. Moving like professionals." Jack gripped his rifle tighter, preparing for a fresh assault. But something about the newcomers' approach didn't fit with the cartel's tactics so far. They weren't rushing in. They were advancing methodically, establishing a cordon rather than pressing directly toward the house. Escobar continued, an edge of desperation now evident in his voice. "My patience is at an end, Holliday. You have 30 seconds to throw out your weapons, or I will order my men to burn this place to the ground with you inside." The newcomers were close enough now that Jack could see details through the smoke. Tactical gear, helmets, and weapons held at the ready. But they weren't engaging. Instead, they had positioned themselves between Escobar's forces and the house, facing outward. Suddenly, a new voice boomed across the battlefield, amplified by some kind of speaker system. "Attention, Escobar forces. This is the Drug Enforcement Administration. You are surrounded. Lay down your weapons and place your hands on your heads. This is your only warning." For a moment, complete silence fell over the property. Then chaos erupted as the cartel forces reacted to this unexpected development. Some threw down their weapons immediately, others opened fire on the DEA agents, and still others made a desperate dash for the remaining vehicles. Jack watched in astonishment as the disciplined DEA team responded with precise, coordinated fire, neutralizing threats while clearly trying to take as many alive as possible. "Well, I'll be damned," Bulldog muttered beside him. Through his earpiece, Preacher's voice was equally stunned. "Did you know about this, Jack?" "Not a clue," Jack replied honestly. "But I'm not complaining." The gunfight was brief but intense. In less than 2 minutes, the remaining cartel forces had either surrendered or been neutralized. Jack watched as DEA agents moved among the downed men, securing weapons and administering first aid where needed. "Doc, Preacher, hold positions," Jack instructed. "Let's make sure this is what it looks like before we start celebrating." He moved cautiously to the front door, rifle still at the ready. Outside, the DEA team had established control of the battlefield with impressive efficiency. Several agents were leading handcuffed cartel members toward the helicopter, while others maintained a security perimeter. One agent broke away from the group and approached the house. He was tall and lean, with close-cropped gray hair visible beneath his tactical helmet. As he got closer, he removed his sunglasses, revealing a face that Jack hadn't seen in nearly 15 years. "Hello, Jack," the man said with a slight smile. "Looks like we arrived just in time." Jack stared in disbelief. "Anderson? Richard Anderson?" The DEA agent nodded. "In the flesh. Been a while, old friend." Richard Anderson had been a junior officer in Jack's Special Forces unit decades ago, before transferring to intelligence work and eventually, it seemed, to the DEA. They had stayed in loose contact for years after Jack's retirement, before eventually drifting apart as old comrades often do. "How did you—" Jack began. Anderson grinned. "Got a very interesting call from a mutual friend yesterday. Said you might be having some unwanted visitors at your ranch." He glanced around at the devastation. "Seems like you had things well in hand, but I figured a little official backup wouldn't hurt." Jack followed Anderson's gaze to where Preacher was emerging from his position, hands raised slightly to identify himself to the DEA agents. The old explosives expert caught Jack's eye and winked. "You called the DEA?" Jack asked when Preacher joined them. "Called an old friend who knows people who know people," Preacher corrected with a shrug. "Figured having the cavalry in reserve couldn't hurt. Didn't expect them to make such a dramatic entrance, though," Anderson chuckled. "Dramatic entrances are part of the job description." His expression turned more serious. "We've been building a case against the Escobars for months. When I heard they were making a move on your property, I convinced my superiors that this was the opportunity we needed to catch them in the act of armed intimidation on U.S. Soil. Behind them, Bulldog emerged from the house and Doc descended from his sniper's nest in the barn. The four veterans gathered around Anderson, a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration on their weathered faces. "What about Escobar?" Jack asked, suddenly remembering the cartel leader. Anderson's expression darkened. "He's in custody. Tried to run when we landed, but didn't get far." He looked at Jack curiously. "You know, most people would have just sold the land and moved on. Why fight?" Jack glanced at his friends, then at the ranch house behind them, battered and bullet-riddled, but still standing. "This is my home," he said simply. "Some things you don't run from." Anderson nodded in understanding. "Well, your stand here just helped us decapitate a major branch of the Escobar operation. The intel we'll get from the prisoners should help Mexican authorities target their main bases south of the border." He grinned. "Not bad for a bunch of retirees." As the DEA agents continued securing the scene, more vehicles began arriving. Sheriff's deputies, ambulances, even a news van that had somehow gotten wind of the situation. Jack watched it all with a strange sense of detachment, the adrenaline of combat slowly fading from his system, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. Bulldog appeared at his side, offering a battered flask. "Medicinal purposes," he explained with a wink. Jack accepted it gratefully, taking a long pull of something that burned pleasantly all the way down. He passed it to Doc, who did the same before handing it to Preacher. "Just like old times," Doc said, watching the flask make its round. Jack nodded, looking at his three friends, battered, graying, aged, but still standing tall after the fight. Brotherhood forged in combat decades ago, proven once again when it mattered most. "Just like old times," he agreed. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, illuminating a battlefield that would soon become evidence in a federal case against one of Mexico's most dangerous cartels. But for Jack Holliday and his old comrades, it was simply the ground they had defended together, one last time. Sheriff Mike's patrol vehicle skidded to a stop amid the chaos, and the lawman emerged, his face a mask of disbelief as he surveyed the scene. He spotted Jack and made his way over, carefully navigating around DEA agents and detained cartel members. "Jack," he said when he reached them, "when I said not to turn my county into a war zone, I was kind of hoping you'd listen." Jack shrugged apologetically. Things escalated. Mike shook his head, but there was no real anger in his expression. "You're going to be filling out paperwork for weeks, you know that, right?" "Worth it," Jack replied simply. As the sheriff moved off to coordinate with the DEA, Jack turned back to his friends. They stood together amid the aftermath of battle. Four old warriors who had proven that age had not diminished their courage or their skill, or their loyalty to one another. The fight was over, but Jack knew their story wasn't. There would be investigations, statements to give, possibly even trials to testify at. And then eventually life would return to some semblance of normalcy. But for now, in this moment, Jack Holliday felt more alive than he had in years. He had stood his ground. He had protected what was his. And he had done it alongside men he would trust with his life, had trusted with his life, repeatedly, over decades of service. "So," Bulldog said, breaking the contemplative silence, "same time next year?" The four veterans burst into laughter, the sound carrying across the battered landscape of Jack's ranch, a defiant celebration of survival, of brotherhood, and of one last mission successfully completed. The sun had reached its zenith in the Arizona sky, beating down mercilessly on the chaos below. Jack's ranch, once a haven of tranquility, now resembled a war zone, which Jack reflected was precisely what it had become. Burned-out vehicles dotted the landscape, shell casings glinted in the dirt, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the air like an invisible fog. DEA agents moved with practiced efficiency across the property, processing evidence and securing detainees. Paramedics tended to the wounded cartel members, while coroners documented the dead. The scale of the operation had grown exponentially in the hours since the gunfire had ceased. Jack sat heavily on his porch steps, an untouched bottle of water in his hand, watching the controlled chaos with a mixture of relief and weariness. His body was finally registering the toll of the past 24 hours. Muscles aching, joints protesting, the old shrapnel wound in his knee throbbing with renewed vigor. Bulldog dropped down beside him with a grunt, his own body clearly making similar complaints. "Getting too old for this shit," he muttered, echoing Jack's thoughts. "Been too old for it for at least a decade," Jack replied with a faint smile. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, two warriors watching the aftermath of battle unfold around them. Finally, Bulldog spoke again, his voice uncharacteristically somber. Remember Kandahar? 2002? Jack nodded slowly. Similar situation. Different desert. Different desert, same story, Bulldog agreed. Bad guys thinking they owned the territory, us showing them otherwise. He gestured at the scene before them. Except back then, we had air support, artillery, a full platoon backing us up. And we were 40 years younger, Jack added. Bulldog chuckled. There's that. He turned to look at Jack directly. Hell of a thing we pulled off here, old man. Before Jack could respond, Richard Anderson approached, his DEA tactical gear now replaced with a more administrative-looking windbreaker. Despite the change in attire, he still carried himself with the bearing of a career operator. Gentlemen, he greeted them, how are you holding up? Still vertical, Bulldog replied with a shrug. Anderson smiled. That's more than I can say for most of Escobar's men. He turned to Jack. Got a minute to talk, Captain? Jack nodded, rising stiffly from the steps. Bulldog made to stand as well, but Anderson waved him back down. Just need to borrow your CO for a moment, he said, using the military abbreviation for commanding officer. Official business. Jack followed Anderson a short distance from the house to where they could speak privately. The DEA agent's expression turned serious once they were alone. I've got good news and complicated news, Anderson began. The good news is that Javier Escobar is securely in custody, along with 15 of his men who survived the engagement. This is a major coup for the agency. We've been trying to get actionable intelligence on the Escobar operation for years. And the complicated news? Jack prompted when Anderson paused. Anderson sighed. The complicated news is that this whole situation has attracted a lot of attention. Not just local news, national. The story's already breaking. Elderly veteran and friends repel cartel invasion. It's going viral. Jack frowned. I don't see the problem. The problem is twofold, Anderson explained. First, there's the matter of the weapons and explosives you and your friends employed, some of which aren't exactly legal for civilian possession. Jack's expression remained impassive. We did what we had to do to defend ourselves. I know that, Anderson assured him. And personally, I think you showed remarkable restraint given the circumstances. But legally, there are questions that will need to be addressed. And the second problem? Anderson's expression grew more concerned. The Escobar cartel isn't just one man, Jack. Javier has brothers, cousins, a whole extended family network running their operation in Mexico. When word gets out that he was captured on your property, he let the implication hang in the air. Jack understood immediately. The battle might be over, but the war had potentially just begun. The cartel would want revenge, and Jack's ranch had just become ground zero for their attention. So what are you suggesting? Jack asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Witness protection, Anderson said, confirming Jack's prediction. New identity, new location, complete disappearance from the grid. For all four of you. Jack looked back at his home, battered and bullet-riddled, but still standing. The gardens that Margaret had lovingly tended. The workshop where he'd spent countless hours restoring antique furniture. The porch where they had watched so many sunsets together. This is my home, Harm, he said simply. Anderson's frustration was evident. It's also a target now, Jack. These people don't forget, and they don't forgive. They'll come back with twice as many men next time. Let them come, Jack replied, his voice hardening. I've spent my whole life facing down threats. I'm not going to start running now. This isn't about courage, Anderson argued. It's about practicality. You can't live in a war zone indefinitely. Jack was saved from responding by the arrival of Doc and Preacher, who approached with purpose in their stride. Sorry to interrupt, Preacher said, not sounding particularly sorry. But we figured you might be getting the time to disappear speech. He glanced knowingly at Anderson. We've been getting the same from your colleagues. Anderson looked between the three veterans, realization dawning on his face. You've already discussed this, Doc nodded. While you were processing Escobar, we anticipated this might be the recommendation. And you've made a decision, Anderson surmised, reading their resolute expressions. We've made a decision, Jack confirmed. Before he could elaborate, Sheriff Mike joined their small circle, looking harried but determined. Jack, we need to talk about security moving forward. I can assign deputies to— Not necessary, Mike, Jack interrupted gently. The sheriff blinked in surprise. Not necessary? Jack, you don't seem to grasp the situation. Once the cartel regroups, he understands, Anderson cut in. Trust me, he just doesn't agree with the standard security protocols. Mike looked between them, confusion evident on his face. Then what's the plan? Because I can tell you right now, my department doesn't have the resources to provide round-the-clock protection indefinitely. Jack exchanged glances with Doc and Preacher, a silent communication born of decades of trust. Then he turned back to the sheriff and DEA agent. "The plan," he said with quiet certainty, "is that I'm staying put. This is my home. I won't be driven from it. And we're staying with him," Doc added, his deep voice brooking no argument, "at least for the foreseeable future." Anderson and Mike stared at them in disbelief. "You can't be serious," the sheriff protested. "4 old men against the entire Escobar cartel?" Preacher's eyes glinted dangerously. 4 old men who just decimated an assault force 3 times their number. "Show some respect, Sheriff." Mike looked appropriately chastened, but Anderson was not so easily deterred. "This isn't bravado talking, is it?" he asked, studying Jack's face carefully. "You actually have a plan," Jack nodded slowly. "We do. But first I have a question for you, Richard." He gestured around at the DEA operation. "How long will all this take to process? The evidence collection, the statements, all of it?" Anderson considered this. "Given the scale, at least a couple of days, maybe 3. And during that time, your people will maintain a presence here?" "Of course. This is now a federal crime scene." Jack smiled slightly. "Then we have 3 days to implement Phase 1. "Phase 1 of what?" Mike asked, his confusion only growing. "Operation Retirement Home," Preacher answered with a wicked grin. Understanding dawned on Anderson's face. "You're going to fortify the property." "More than fortify," Doc clarified. "We're going to transform it," Jack elaborated, warming to the subject. "This ranch has good bones, defensively speaking. Decent sight lines, natural choke points, elevated positions for overwatch. But it was designed as a home, not a fortress. We're going to change that." "And you think the 4 of you can accomplish this in 3 days?" Mike asked skeptically. "4 of us, plus whatever help we can recruit," Jack corrected. "I imagine some of your deputies might volunteer their off-duty time, and I know several veterans in the area who would understand what we're facing." Mike still looked dubious, but Anderson was nodding slowly, his tactical mind clearly seeing the possibilities. "It's not as crazy as it sounds," the DEA agent admitted. "With proper preparations and the right defensive setup, a small force can hold off a much larger one. We've seen it throughout military history." "And you're forgetting something important," Preacher added. "The Escobars just took a major hit. Javier in custody, dozens of their men dead or captured, a significant intelligence breach. They'll be reeling, regrouping. That buys us time." "How much time?" Mike pressed. Jack shrugged. "Impossible to say with certainty. Could be weeks, could be months, but they will come eventually. And when they do, we'll be ready." Anderson studied the 3 veterans, then looked past them to where Bulldog was still sitting on the porch steps, cleaning a pistol with meticulous care. The DEA agent's expression shifted from skepticism to something approaching respect. "You know," he said finally, "in all my years with the agency, I've seen a lot of people fold under cartel pressure. Run, hide, or worse, cooperate. I've never seen anyone choose to stand and fight." He shook his head in wonder. "You 4 are either the bravest men I've ever met or the craziest." "Bit of both," Preacher acknowledged with a grin. Anderson sighed in resignation. "I can't officially endorse this plan. If anyone asks, I advised witness protection and you refused." "Understood," Jack said. "But unofficially," Anderson glanced around to ensure no other agents were within earshot, "I might be able to provide some resources. Intelligence on cartel movements, advanced warning systems, maybe even some specialized equipment that fell off the back of a truck." Jack extended his hand. "We'd appreciate any help you can provide." As they shook hands, Mike looked between them with growing alarm. Are you both insane? This isn't some action movie. These are real cartel killers we're talking about." "We know exactly what we're dealing with, Sheriff," Doc said solemnly. "Better than most." Mike threw up his hands in frustration. "Fine, it's your funeral." But despite his words, there was a glimmer of admiration in his eyes. "For what it's worth, I think you're all certified lunatics. But damn if I don't respect the hell out of what you did here today." With that, the sheriff stalked off to coordinate with his deputies, muttering about stubborn old fools and more paperwork than I've seen in 20 years. Anderson watched him go with a faint smile. "He'll come around, and he'll help, whether he admits it or not." "We know," Jack replied. "Mike's a good man." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a black SUV with government plates, which pulled up near the command post the DEA had established. A stern-looking woman in a crisp suit emerged, surveying the scene with an expression of controlled displeasure. "My boss," Anderson explained with a grimace. "Time to face the music for authorizing this operation on short notice." He started toward the SUV, then paused and looked back. "For what it's worth, Jack, What you and your team did here today, it was one for the books. The kind of story agency trainers will be telling for years. After Anderson departed, Jack rejoined Doc and Preacher, and together they walked back to where Bulldog waited on the porch. "So?" Bulldog asked as they approached. "We doing this?" Jack nodded. "We're doing this." Bulldog grinned, a predatory expression that belied his age. "Good to know. The good." Retirement was getting boring anyway. The four veterans gathered on the porch, looking out over the battlefield that had once been Jack's front yard. To anyone observing, they might have appeared as nothing more than elderly men, worn down by time and the ravages of hard lives. But beneath the gray hair and weathered skin, the spirit that had carried them through decades of service still burned bright. "First things first," Jack said, slipping naturally back into the role of commander. "We need to assess the damage, inventory what supplies we have left, and identify our most immediate defensive needs." Doc nodded. "I'll check the structures. See what needs reinforcing first." "I'll inventory our remaining weapons and ammunition," Bulldog volunteered. "And I'll start planning our perimeter security upgrades," Preacher added. "Got some ideas involving motion sensors, remote cameras, and a few surprises for uninvited guests." Jack felt a strange sense of déjà vu as his old team dispersed to their assigned tasks. How many times had they done this over the years? Assessing, planning, preparing for the next mission? Only this time, the mission was here, on his own property, and the stakes were intensely personal. As the others moved off, Jack remained on the porch for a moment longer, his gaze drawn to the bullet holes that now marred Margaret's carefully painted trim. He ran his fingers over the splintered wood, a complex mixture of emotions churning within him. "I'm sorry, Maggie," he whispered. "I know this isn't what you wanted for our home." For a moment, he could almost hear her voice in response. "It's still standing, isn't it? Just needs a little patching up. Like someone else I know." Jack smiled at the thought. Margaret had always seen through his stoic exterior, had always understood the warrior that lived beneath the farmer he'd tried to become. She wouldn't have run either. With renewed determination, Jack turned and entered the house. In the kitchen, he found Bulldog already at work, weapons spread across the table in organized rows. "Assessment?" Jack asked. Bulldog looked up from his task. "Better than expected. We used about 60% of our ammunition during the fight. Still have enough for a serious engagement, but we'll want to resupply. Weapons all functioned well. Minimal maintenance needed." Jack nodded, making mental notes. "How are you fixed for your personal equipment?" "Got enough to last a week or so," Bulldog replied. "After that, I'll need to make a supply run. Make a list. We'll consolidate with the others." Jack moved through the house, cataloging damage as he went. Broken windows, bullet-riddled walls, a door hanging crookedly on its hinges. All repairable. The structure itself had held up remarkably well, considering the intensity of the firefight. Outside, he found Doc examining the barn with the practiced eye of an engineer. "How bad?" Jack asked as he approached. "Structurally sound," Doc reported. "Some cosmetic damage, but nothing that compromises the integrity. Makes for good cover still." He pointed to the hayloft where he'd conducted his sharpshooting. That position worked well. Might be worth reinforcing it. Maybe adding some armor plating if we can get our hands on some." Jack nodded in agreement. "Anderson might be able to help with that. He suggested he can provide some unofficial support." Doc raised an eyebrow. "DEA resources? That could be useful." "My thoughts exactly." They continued their assessment, moving methodically around the property. In the equipment shed, they found Preacher surrounded by electronic components, already tinkering with what looked like improvised security devices. "Salvaging what I can from my gear," he explained without looking up from his work. "These motion sensors held up well. If I can get my hands on a few more, we can establish a perimeter early warning system that would make a military base jealous." Jack watched him work for a moment, reminded again of the unique skills each of his friends brought to the table. Preacher had always been the tech specialist of their group, with an uncanny ability to improvise solutions from limited resources. "Anderson might be able to help with gear," Jack told him. "Make a list of what you need." Preacher grinned. "Already started one. It's ambitious. I'd expect nothing less." By late afternoon, the four veterans had completed their initial assessment and regrouped in Jack's kitchen. The table, now cleared of weapons, was covered instead with hand-drawn maps, lists of supplies, and rough sketches of defensive modifications. "All right," Jack began, looking at the assembled materials. "Let's put together our plan. 3 phases. Immediate needs for basic security, secondary improvements for when we have more resources, and long-term enhancements if we have enough time. They worked through the evening, drawing on decades of collective experience in combat operations, base security, and defensive tactics. As the sun began to set, their plan took shape. A comprehensive strategy to transform Jack's ranch from a vulnerable homestead into a defensible position capable of withstanding a determined assault. Sheriff Mike returned as they were finishing, looking exhausted but less agitated than before. He stood in the doorway, observing their planning session with a mixture of professional interest and lingering concern. "You boys really are serious about this," he remarked, more a statement than a question. Jack looked up from the table. "Dead serious, Mike." The sheriff sighed heavily. "Then you should know that I've been talking with some of my deputies. When word got out about what happened here today, well, let's just say you've got more admirers in the department than you might have realized." "Meaning?" Bulldog prompted. "Meaning I've got 6 deputies who volunteered to help with your renovations during their off-duty hours. 3 of them are veterans themselves. They understand what you're up against." Jack exchanged surprised glances with his friends. "That's unexpected, but appreciated," Mike shrugged uncomfortably. Don't get me wrong. I still think you're all certifiable. But if you're determined to make a stand, better you have proper backup." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and placed it on the table. "That's a list of local folks who've also volunteered to help. Ranchers, contractors, a couple of ex-military types who settled in the area." Jack unfolded the paper, scanning the dozen or so names listed there. Some he recognized, others were unfamiliar, but all had contact information and notes about their skills or resources they could provide. "Word travels fast," Doc observed. "Small community," Mike replied. "And people around here don't take kindly to cartels thinking they can just move in and push folks around. What you did today, it's resonated." Jack felt a strange tightness in his chest. He'd lived a relatively solitary life since Margaret's passing, interacting with the community when necessary, but largely keeping to himself. The idea that so many people would rally to his cause was both surprising and deeply moving. "Thank them for us," he said, his voice gruffer than usual. "And let them know we'll be in touch tomorrow about coordinating efforts." Mike nodded. "Will do." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Anderson told me about your conversation earlier. About the cartel seeking revenge." His expression grew serious. "He's right, you know. They will come. And next time, they'll come prepared for a fight." "So will we," Jack replied simply. Mike studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, a gesture of respect from one professional to another. Without another word, he turned and left. The 4 veterans returned to their planning, working late into the night. They paused only briefly for a meal of canned soup and crackers. The battle had left little time for grocery shopping before diving back in. It was well past midnight when Jack finally called a halt. "We've got a solid foundation," he said, surveying the plans spread across the table. "Tomorrow we can start implementing. For now, we all need rest." The others agreed, though somewhat reluctantly. The adrenaline had long since worn off, replaced by the bone-deep fatigue that follows intense combat. But their minds were still racing with possibilities, contingencies, scenarios. Sleeping arrangements were simple. Doc took the spare bedroom, Bulldog claimed the couch, and Preacher opted for a sleeping bag on the screen porch, claiming the desert night air helped him think. Jack retreated to his own bedroom, but not before setting up a watch rotation. Old habits die hard. As Jack settled onto his bed, his body screaming in protest at every movement, he found himself thinking not of the battle past or the challenges ahead, but of Margaret. Her photograph sat on his nightstand, her smile frozen in time, eyes crinkling at the corners in the way he'd always loved. "Quite a day, Maggie," he murmured to the empty room. "Not exactly the quiet retirement you had in mind for us." He could almost hear her response. "You were never cut out for quiet, Jack Holliday." Not really. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps the peaceful rancher had always been a role he was playing, an attempt to be the man she deserved rather than the warrior he'd been trained to be. And yet she had loved him anyway, had seen through the disguise to the man beneath. Sleep claimed him eventually, a dreamless void of exhaustion. When he woke to watery dawn light filtering through his window, Jack felt simultaneously refreshed and ancient. His body a catalog of aches and pains, but his mind sharper than it had been in years. He found Preacher already awake, tinkering with electronic components at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee at his elbow. The explosives expert looked up as Jack entered, offering a nod of greeting. Perimeter sensors are ready for deployment, Preacher reported without preamble. Once we determine the final layout, we can have them operational within hours. Jack nodded, pouring himself coffee from the pot Preacher had already brewed. Good. Priority 1 is early warning systems. We won't have the element of surprise next time. They were soon joined by Doc and Bulldog, and the 4 veterans shared a simple breakfast while refining their plans for the day. They were discussing material needs when a knock at the door interrupted them. Jack answered cautiously, old instincts still on high alert, to find Sheriff Mike on his porch, accompanied by 3 men in civilian clothing. "Morning, Jack," Mike greeted him, looking more rested than the previous evening. "These are the first of your volunteers. Thought you might want to get an early start." The men introduced themselves, a local contractor, a retired Marine, and a rancher whose property bordered Jack's land. All 3 carried tool bags and wore expressions of quiet determination. "Heard what happened yesterday," the contractor said, extending his hand to Jack. "Figured you could use some help fixing up." "My son's with the Border Patrol," the rancher added. "Tells me the Escobars have been a problem for years. About time someone stood up to them." More volunteers arrived throughout the morning. Mike's off-duty deputies, veterans from around the county, local men and women with various skills to offer. By noon, Jack's ranch had transformed into a bustling worksite, with teams tackling different aspects of the defensive preparations. Jack found himself in the unaccustomed role of site manager, coordinating the various efforts, allocating resources, and ensuring that everyone understood the overall strategy. His friends seamlessly integrated into the operation. Doc overseeing structural reinforcements, Bulldog handling weapons and tactical positioning, Preacher directing the installation of his security systems. Anderson arrived mid-afternoon, accompanied by a nondescript van that proved to contain a treasure trove of surplus equipment, body armor, communications gear, night vision devices, and various other tools that would significantly enhance their defensive capabilities. "Officially, none of this exists," the DEA agent explained with a wink. "And I was never here." Jack clasped his hand gratefully. "Understood and appreciated." As the day progressed, Jack was struck by the sense of community that had materialized around his cause. People who had been strangers yesterday worked alongside each other with common purpose, sharing tools, expertise, and stories. Veterans swapped tales of service, comparing notes on deployments and duty stations. Civilians listened with respect, occasionally offering their own perspectives on the cartel's encroachment into their quiet corner of Arizona. By sunset, the transformation was already remarkable. Windows had been reinforced with steel shutters fashioned from scrap metal. Firing positions had been established at strategic points around the property, each with cleared fields of fire and protected approaches. Preacher's electronic early warning system formed a perimeter that would alert them to any approach, day or night. The volunteers departed as darkness fell, promising to return the following day to continue the work. Jack and his friends gathered on the porch, sharing beers and a sense of accomplishment as they reviewed the day's progress. "Not bad for one day's work," Bulldog remarked, surveying the property. "Community coming together," Doc observed. "Powerful thing." Preacher nodded in agreement. "Reminds me of a village we helped in Afghanistan. Once they realized we were actually there to protect them, not just passing through, they pitched in with everything they had." Jack sipped his beer thoughtfully. "Different here, though. These people are helping us protect my property, not their own." "Are they?" Doc challenged gently. "Or are they protecting something larger? Their community, their way of life. The idea that they can live without fear of cartels moving in and taking what they want." Jack considered this. Perhaps Doc was right. Perhaps his stand had become symbolic of something larger than just one man protecting his home. Their contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar vehicle, Sheriff Mike's patrol SUV, pulling up to the house for what was becoming a regular evening briefing. "Got some news," Mike announced as he joined them on the porch. "Border Patrol intercepted a cartel courier this afternoon. Had communications from Mexico to cartel cells in Arizona." He met Jack's gaze directly. "They're talking about you, about what happened here." "What are they saying?" Jack asked, though he could guess. Mike's expression was grim. "The Escobar family is not pleased, as you might imagine. Javier was their primary coordinator for U.S. operations. His capture has disrupted their entire northern network. And they're looking for payback," Bulldog surmised. "In a big way," Mike confirmed. "Border Patrol intelligence suggests they're pulling together resources for a significant response. Timeline is unclear, but they're moving with purpose." Jack nodded, absorbing this information. It confirmed what they had already anticipated, but hearing it made the threat more concrete, more immediate. "Any specifics on numbers or weaponry?" Preacher asked, ever the tactician. Mike shook his head. "Nothing solid yet, but the communications suggested they're treating this as a major operation, bringing in specialists from other areas. Special forces types," Doc translated. "Like the ones we faced yesterday, but more of them. Better equipped?" "Likely," Mike agreed. "I've put the department on heightened alert, and I've been in touch with state police about additional support. But resources are always stretched thin out here." He looked around at the four veterans. "You sure you want to stay this course? There are still other options." Jack exchanged glances with his friends, seeing in their eyes the same resolve he felt. "We're sure, Mike, but we appreciate the warning." After the sheriff departed, the four men returned to their planning, now with the confirmed knowledge that a second, larger attack was indeed coming. They worked late into the night, refining strategies, identifying potential weaknesses, and prioritizing the next day's tasks. As they finally prepared for sleep, Bulldog voiced what they were all thinking. "Round 1 went our way. Round 2 is going to be a whole different fight." "Good thing we've never been afraid of a challenge," Preacher replied with a grim smile. Doc nodded in agreement. "Besides, we've got something they don't." "What's that?" Jack asked. "Home field advantage," Doc said simply. "And something worth fighting for." Jack looked around at his home, battered but standing, being transformed into a fortress by his friends and a community that had rallied to his cause. He thought of Margaret, of the life they'd built here, of the peace he'd found in this quiet corner of the desert. "Something worth fighting for," he echoed softly. "Yes, we certainly do." As he drifted towards sleep that night, Jack found himself thinking of all the missions he'd undertaken over his long career. Operations in jungles, deserts, mountains, and cities across the globe. Fighting for country, for duty, for the man next to him. But never before had he fought for something so personal, so fundamentally his own. This wasn't just another mission. This was his home, his land, his stand. And somehow it had become something more. A line drawn in the sand, a declaration that some things could not be taken by force or intimidation. Not while men like Jack Holliday and his brothers in arms still drew breath. The coming days would test that declaration to its limits. But as Jack surrendered to exhaustion, one certainty remained unshaken in his mind. They would be ready. The transformation of Jack Holliday's ranch continued with remarkable speed over the next 5 days. What had begun as a modest defensive upgrade had evolved into something far more comprehensive, a carefully engineered stronghold designed to repel a determined assault force. Jack stood on the roof of his house, surveying the property with a critical eye. The changes were both subtle and profound. To a casual observer, the ranch might appear only slightly modified. A few reinforced structures, some new fencing, additional outbuildings. But to Jack's trained eye, each modification represented a strategic advantage. "Quite a view," Preacher remarked as he joined Jack on the roof. "Hard to believe what we've accomplished in less than a week." The main house had been fortified with steel plating behind the wooden exterior walls. Windows had been replaced with impact-resistant glass, augmented by deployable steel shutters. The barn had undergone similar reinforcement, with the addition of a concealed sniper's nest in the hayloft, Doc's preferred position. But the most significant changes were in the surrounding landscape. Under Preacher's direction, they had established a comprehensive security perimeter, utilizing both electronic and physical defenses. Anyone approaching within half a mile would trigger alerts, giving them precious advance warning. "It's a masterpiece," Preacher continued. "Reminds me of that fire base we set up in the Korangal Valley." "Hard to forget," Jack replied, "though we had a lot more official support back then." They descended to the barn where Bulldog and Doc were unpacking crates, military-grade explosives, and medical supplies provided by Anderson, the DEA agent who had gone above and beyond unofficial support. "Anderson's taking quite a risk," Jack observed quietly. "He's invested now," Preacher replied. "We all are." What had begun as 4 old warriors defending a homestead had evolved into something more complex, a community standing against a threat that had been allowed to fester too long. Jack had heard the volunteers talking as they worked, sharing stories of cartel intimidation, of businesses forced to pay protection money, of local authorities hamstrung by jurisdiction issues. His stand had become symbolic, a rallying point for frustrations that had been building for years. Intelligence from both Anderson and Sheriff Mike confirmed that the Escobar cartel was indeed preparing a significant response. Border Patrol had intercepted several cartel members attempting to cross into Arizona with weapons and communications equipment. Surveillance suggested they were establishing forward staging areas just south of the border. "Brought you something," Sheriff Mike said, arriving with supplies. "Got a call from Border Patrol an hour ago. They intercepted a vehicle trying to cross near Nogales. Found detailed maps of your property inside, along with aerial photographs taken in the last 48 hours. They're doing reconnaissance," Jack observed. Looks that way. And they're getting close to making their move. "How long?" Mike shrugged helplessly. "Hard to say, but my gut tells me we're talking days, not weeks." By the evening, 14 volunteers had committed to staying when the attack came. They ranged from ex-military to local ranchers, men and women who shared a common determination to stand against the cartel's encroachment. Jack integrated them into the defensive plan, ensuring each understood their position and responsibilities. As they finalized preparations, Sheriff Mike's patrol vehicle approached at high speed. "Just hit me, Jack." "We've got movement," the sheriff called urgently. Border Patrol spotted a convoy crossing 30 miles south. 6 vehicles, heavily loaded, heading north on backcountry roads. "Timeline?" Preacher asked. "Hard to say exactly. They're moving carefully, using terrain for concealment, based on their previous pace. La Rushes Nesurintineni. Maybe 3 hours." Jack processed this information rapidly. "That's enough time for final preparations, but just barely." Mike handed bulletproof vests to each of the veterans. "I've already alerted my deputies. They're mobilizing now, but response time will be at least 15 minutes from when the shooting starts." "You should go too," Jack told Mike. "This isn't your fight, not directly." The sheriff looked offended. "Like hell it isn't. These bastards are operating in my county, threatening my constituents. I'm staying at least until my deputies arrive." "All right, but you take your orders from me while you're here. This is a military operation now, not law enforcement." As the sun began its descent, the defenders moved to their assigned positions. Jack walked the perimeter one last time, checking positions, encouraging his people, making small adjustments to fields of fire. Inside the house, he found his 3 oldest friends gathered around the kitchen table, checking weapons and equipment. No words were needed. They had said everything that mattered over decades of friendship and shared danger. Bulldog silently offered Jack his M14 rifle, freshly cleaned and loaded. Doc passed him a tactical radio. Preacher handed him a detonator control, the key to their explosive defenses. Jack accepted each item solemnly, understanding the symbolism of the moment. His friends weren't just giving him equipment, they were reaffirming their trust in his leadership, their commitment to following him into battle one last time. "Positions in 30 minutes, Jack said finally. "They'll be here soon." Outside, the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. Soon darkness would fall, bringing with it the advantage of their night vision equipment and pre-sighted firing positions. Jack Holliday took his position in the main house, overlooking the eastern approach where the cartel forces were expected to appear. Radio chatter confirmed that all defensive positions were manned and operational. Now they waited as the shadows lengthened and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The calm before the storm. Darkness had fully enveloped the desert when the first alert came through Jack's earpiece. "Movement on the eastern perimeter," Preacher's voice reported calmly. "Multiple heat signatures approaching through the ravine. Slow and careful. These guys know what they're doing." Jack pressed the transmit button on his radio. Copy that. All positions maintain discipline. No one fires until I give the command." Acknowledgements came in from each defensive position. Terse, professional responses that told Jack his improvised force was holding steady despite the tension. Through the night vision monocular, Jack scanned the eastern approach, focusing on the shallow ravine that cut across the corner of his property. It was the most logical route for an attacking force seeking cover, and precisely why they had concentrated so many of their defensive preparations in that area. "Visual confirmation," came Doc's voice from his position in the barn loft. "I count at least 12 personnel moving in tactical formation. Advance guard, I'd say. Main force likely behind them." Jack watched as shadowy figures materialized at the edge of the ravine, moving with the disciplined precision of trained operators. They advanced in pairs, one covering while the other moved, maintaining spacing and communication through hand signals. These weren't ordinary cartel soldiers. They were professionals, possibly former military or police, who had been recruited or coerced into cartel service. "They've reached the first sensor line," Preacher reported. "Holding position now. Looks like they're deploying surveillance equipment of their own." Jack wasn't surprised. After their first encounter, the cartel would be wary of another ambush. They were taking their time, probing methodically rather than rushing in. "Bulldog status on the western approach?" Jack asked, concerned about a potential flanking maneuver. "All clear so far," came the gruff reply. "Got 4 defenders scanning continuous. No movement detected." Sheriff Mike appeared at Jack's side, his expression tense but focused. "My deputies are staged 2 miles out, maintaining radio silence as requested. They'll move on my signal." Jack nodded acknowledgement, his attention still fixed on the advancing figures. "Let's hope we can resolve this before they need to get involved." Minutes stretched into an hour as the cartel's advance team methodically surveyed the approach to the ranch. They had advanced barely 100 yards from the ravine, moving with exaggerated caution, clearly searching for traps or ambush positions. "Smart," Doc commented over the comm. "They're not making the same mistakes twice." "Patience," Jack reminded everyone. "Let them commit fully before we reveal our positions." Another 30 minutes passed in tense silence before Preacher's voice broke through again. "New movement. Vehicles approaching from the east. Lights out, moving slow." Jack refocused his night vision toward the distant road. 3 dark shapes materialized against the backdrop of the desert. SUVs moving without headlights, navigating by starlight and likely night vision of their own. They stopped well back from the property, maintaining distance while the advance team continued their careful approach. "More personnel dismounting from the vehicles," Doc reported. "I count at least 15, possibly 20. Heavy weapons visible. They're assembling something. Looks like a mortar system." Jack's stomach tightened. A mortar would change the equation dramatically, allowing them to bombard the ranch from a safe distance, potentially neutralizing the defensive advantage. "Bulldog, shift 2 of your people to reinforce the house. If they start dropping shells, we'll need to move quickly to fallback positions." "Copy that." The cartel's strategy was becoming clear. The advance team would probe for defenses, while the main force established fire support positions. Once they had the range, they'd soften targets with indirect fire before launching a coordinated assault. "They're better organized than I expected," Sheriff Mike muttered beside him. Jack nodded grimly. They learned from last time. "Brought in specialists," he keyed his radio again. "All positions, be prepared for indirect fire. When it starts, hold position until ordered otherwise. Our reinforced structures should withstand initial bombardment." Even as he spoke, Jack was recalculating their defensive plan. The presence of a mortar changed the timeline. They needed to disrupt the cartel force before they could effectively deploy their heavy weapons. "Preacher, status on remote package Alpha? Armed and ready. Waiting for your command." Jack studied the distribution of cartel forces through his night vision. The advance team had now moved approximately 200 yards onto his property, approaching the first major defensive position. A seemingly innocent rise of ground that concealed their first surprise. Behind them, the main force was establishing its position, centering around the mortar team that was now clearly visible, setting up their weapon on a small rise that offered good sightlines to the ranch buildings. "Doc, can you get a shot on the mortar team?" A pause, then, "Negative. They're keeping good discipline, staying low. I'd need to expose myself too much for a clean shot, and they've got at least 2 spotters scanning for exactly that." Jack weighed his options. They could wait until the cartel forces committed further, potentially allowing the mortar to become operational. Or they could initiate now, using their prepared defenses while the enemy was still deploying. The decision was made for him when Preacher's urgent voice came through the comm. "Movement on the western perimeter. Fast approach, multiple vehicles." Jack swung his night vision toward the western edge of his property. Sure enough, headlights had appeared, bouncing across the rough terrain as several vehicles approached at high speed from the opposite direction. "It's a 2-pronged assault," Jack realized aloud. The eastern approach was deliberate misdirection, drawing our attention while their main force comes in from the west. "They're 3 minutes out, coming in hot," Bulldog reported, tension evident in his voice. "My position is exposed if they maintain that approach vector." Jack made a split-second decision. "All western positions prepare to engage. Eastern defensive team, hold position." He keyed to Preacher's channel. "Execute Alpha and Beta packages now." "Executing," Preacher confirmed. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. Then the night erupted into chaos. Twin explosions tore through the darkness at the eastern perimeter, precisely where the advance team had been probing. The carefully concealed Claymore mines detonated in sequence, sweeping their deadly payload across the open ground. Simultaneously, shaped charges buried along the ravine exploded, collapsing portions of the sides onto the area where the mortar team had been establishing their position. The night was suddenly transformed into day as the explosions illuminated the desert landscape. Through his night vision, Jack saw bodies thrown by the blasts, others scrambling for cover that wasn't there. The eastern attack had been effectively neutralized before it fully formed, but there was no time to celebrate. The western approach had become the primary threat, and it was developing rapidly. "Western team engaging," Bulldog's voice called over the sound of automatic fire erupting from the defensive positions along the western perimeter. Jack sprinted from his position in the house toward the reinforced shed that overlooked the western approach. Sheriff Mike followed close behind, their boots kicking up dust as they covered the distance in seconds. From the new vantage point, Jack could see 4 vehicles racing toward the ranch, 2 SUVs and what appeared to be pickup trucks with mounted weapons. They were moving fast, clearly hoping to overwhelm the defenses through speed and firepower rather than caution. The defenders along the western perimeter had opened up with coordinated fire, targeting the lead vehicles with a disciplined volley that spoke to their military training. Even in the chaos, they maintained fire discipline, focusing on drivers and gunners rather than spraying wildly. The lead SUV suddenly swerved as its windshield disintegrated under concentrated fire. It veered sharply, then rolled dramatically, flipping twice before coming to rest on its roof, wheels still spinning uselessly in the air. The second vehicle attempted to maneuver around it, but hit something in the darkness, one of the concealed barriers they had installed days earlier. The impact wasn't catastrophic, but it stalled the vehicle's momentum, making it a stationary target for the defenders. "Keep pressure on the disabled vehicles," Jack ordered through the comm. "Don't let them regroup." The 2 pickup trucks had slowed their approach, now advancing more cautiously after seeing the fate of the lead vehicles. Mounted gunners in their beds opened up with what sounded like heavy machine guns, sending tracer rounds streaking through the darkness toward the defensive positions. "Taking heavy fire at position 3, came a strained voice over the comm, one of the volunteers, a former Marine named Torres. "Maintain position, but keep your head down," Jack instructed. "Bulldog, can you suppress that technical on the left?" "Working on it," Bulldog grunted, followed by the distinctive sound of his M240 machine gun, opening up in a sustained burst. The firefight intensified as the cartel forces from the disabled vehicles recovered and began to advance on foot, using the terrain for cover as they moved toward the ranch buildings. Jack counted at least 15 figures moving tactically across the western approach, with more still active in the vehicles. "Doc, we need support on the western perimeter," Jack called into his radio. "Moving now," Doc confirmed. "Have visual on multiple targets from my position. Taking shots when clean." The crack of Doc's sniper rifle punctuated the chaos at measured intervals, each shot followed by a target dropping and not rising again. The man's marksmanship remained exceptional despite his age, a testament to skills honed over decades and maintained through rigorous practice. For several minutes, the battle hung in precarious balance. The cartel forces had the advantage of numbers, but the defenders held superior positions and had the benefit of extensive preparation. Tracer rounds crisscrossed the darkness, muzzle flashes illuminating the night in strobing bursts, the sounds of different weapons creating a deadly symphony. Jack moved between defensive positions along the western perimeter, directing fire, encouraging his people, occasionally taking shots of his own when targets presented themselves. Despite the chaos, he maintained a clear mental map of the battlefield, identifying patterns in the cartel's movements, anticipating their next actions. "They're setting up another heavy weapon at the boulder cluster," he warned over the comm. "Position 2 and 4, concentrate fire there before they can establish." The defenders responded immediately, shifting their fire to the indicated position. A cartel gunner rose briefly to mount what looked like a light machine gun on a tripod, only to be cut down by coordinated fire from multiple directions. "Eastern perimeter reporting," Preacher's voice cut through the tactical chatter. "Survivors from the initial blast are regrouping. Looks like they're preparing to provide support to the western assault. Maybe 10 effectives remaining." Jack processed this information quickly. They were facing a more coordinated attack than anticipated, with the eastern and western forces now attempting to synchronize their efforts despite the initial disruption. "Preacher, delay them. Use package Delta." "With pleasure." Moments later, a series of smaller explosions erupted along the eastern perimeter, followed by the distinctive whoosh of trip flares igniting. The sudden illumination would destroy the night vision capabilities of the eastern force, forcing them to delay or advance blind. "Nice touch," Sheriff Mike commented beside Jack, his own rifle trained on the approaching forces. Basic counter-night ops, Jack replied. Preacher insisted on including them in our preparations. A sudden increase in fire from the cartel position drew their attention back to the immediate threat. The cartel forces had established a base of fire behind the disabled vehicles and were now attempting to advance under its cover, moving in short rushes toward the outer defensive perimeter. They're probing for weak points, Jack observed, trying to find a gap in our coverage. Position 5 taking casualties, came an urgent call over the comm. 2 defenders down, need medical. Jack recognized the voice. Wheeler, the contractor who had been instrumental in their preparations. His position was on the far western edge, covering the approach to the barn. Doc, casualties at position 5. Can you assist? On my way, Doc replied without hesitation. Bulldog, can you cover my movement? Got you, Bulldog confirmed, immediately opening up with suppressive fire to cover Doc's dash from his position to the wounded defenders. Jack turned to Sheriff Mike. I need to shift to position 5 to reinforce. Can you maintain command here? Mike nodded grimly, his expression determined despite the stress evident in his features. Go. I've got this. Jack moved quickly but carefully, using the trenches and covered pathways they had established to navigate between defensive positions without exposing himself unnecessarily. As he approached position 5, he could hear Doc's calm voice giving instructions over the sounds of gunfire. Pressure here, just like that. It's a through and through. Miss the major vessels. You'll be fine. The wounded defender was one of the younger volunteers, a local rancher's son barely in his 20s. Despite the blood seeping through the makeshift bandage on his shoulder, his expression was determined as he clutched his rifle with his good arm. I can still shoot, sir, he told Jack, his face pale but resolute. Save your strength, Jack replied, checking the position's defensive setup. Wheeler was still manning the primary firing position, exchanging fire with cartel gunmen who had worked their way to within 100 yards of their location. They're getting bolder, Wheeler reported without taking his eye from his rifle sight. Found a drainage ditch that gives them covered approach. Already lost Davis and Mitchell. Not dead, but hit bad enough Doc had to evacuate them to the barn. Jack assessed the situation quickly. The position was indeed vulnerable, with the unexpected approach route allowing the cartel forces to gain ground more rapidly than anticipated. The defensive fire was sufficient to keep them from advancing directly, but they were slowly establishing positions that could eventually flank the defenders. We need to close that approach route, Jack decided. Doc, can you handle things here for a few minutes? Doc nodded, his hands steady as he finished treating the wounded volunteer. I'll go. We'll hold. Jack retreated to a small depression behind the defensive position, keying his radio. Preacher, I need a remote package deployed to the drainage ditch west of position 5. Can you redirect? Negative on remote deployment, Preacher replied after a moment. I'd need direct line of sight to place accurately. But I can reach that position if I circle around through the covered trench. Jack considered the risk. The trench was protected, but Preacher would need to cross a small exposed section to reach the necessary vantage point. Too dangerous, Jack decided. I'll handle it myself. With respect, Captain, I'm better with the packages than you are, Preacher countered. Always have been. Before Jack could argue further, Preacher's voice came again, more determined this time. I'm already moving. Cover me when I hit the exposed section. 30 seconds. Jack swore under his breath but moved quickly to a position where he could provide covering fire. Preacher was right. He had always been the explosives expert among them, able to place charges with a precision the others couldn't match. Bulldog, we need suppression fire on the western ditch approach in 30 seconds. Preacher's making a move. Copy that. Ready on your mark. Jack counted down, then gave the signal. Now! Bulldog's machine gun erupted in a sustained burst, joined by coordinated fire from positions 3 and 4. The cartel forces in and around the drainage ditch were forced to duck for cover, momentarily halting their advance. In that brief window, Jack caught a glimpse of Preacher's figure darting across the exposed gap, moving with a speed and agility that belied his age. He made it to cover just as the cartel gunmen began returning fire, bullets kicking up dust where he had been moments before. I'm clear, Preacher confirmed over the comm. Moving to deployment position now. For 2 tense minutes, there was no word from Preacher. Jack maintained his position, periodically firing at targets of opportunity while watching for any sign of his friend's progress. The battle continued to rage around them, the night punctuated by muzzle flashes in the crack of gunfire from multiple directions. Package deployed, Preacher's voice finally came through. Freacher, 40-second timer. Suggest immediate withdrawal from forward positions near the ditch. Jack relayed the warning to all nearby defensive positions. 40 seconds later, a massive explosion tore through the drainage ditch, sending earth, debris, and unfortunately for the cartel, human bodies flying into the night air. The carefully placed charges had not only eliminated the immediate threat, but had effectively collapsed the ditch itself, removing it as a covered approach route. Direct hit, Bulldog reported with satisfaction. At least 6 tangos down. Rest, falling back to regroup. The Western assault had been stalled, but Jack knew the battle was far from over. The cartel forces still outnumbered them significantly, and they had shown a level of tactical discipline that suggested experienced leadership. All positions report status, Jack ordered, needing to assess their overall situation. The reports came in quickly. 2 positions compromised on the western perimeter, 3 defenders seriously wounded but stable under Doc's care, ammunition running lower than ideal but still sufficient for a sustained engagement. The eastern force remained contained but active, occasionally probing for weaknesses but mostly providing long-range fire support for their western counterparts. As Jack processed these reports, Preacher rejoined him at position 5, his face streaked with dirt and sweat but wearing a satisfied expression. That should keep them honest for a while, he remarked, checking his remaining equipment. I've got 2 packages left, strategically placed at likely rally points. Remote detonation ready when needed. Jack nodded in acknowledgement, his mind already working on the next phase of their defense. The initial cartel assault had been blunted, but he had no illusions about their determination. They would regroup, adapt, and come again with a new approach. They're pulling back across all fronts, Doc reported from his elevated position, which gave him a better overall view of the battlefield. Regrouping at their vehicles. Looks like they're bringing in something new. Can't quite make it out yet. Minutes passed as the cartel forces reorganized, the intensity of fire diminishing to occasional exchanges rather than continuous engagement. Jack used the respite to check on his people, ensure ammunition was redistributed where needed, and assess damage to their defensive positions. Jack, Sheriff Mike's urgent voice came through the comm. You need to see this. Jack moved quickly to rejoin the sheriff at their command position. Mike handed him a pair of high-powered binoculars, pointing toward the cartel's staging area. Through the magnified lenses, Jack could see cartel members unloading something from one of the surviving vehicles, a long, tube-like object that he recognized immediately. Rocket launcher, he confirmed grimly. Looks like an RPG-7 or similar. Mike's expression darkened. That changes things. Our reinforced positions will hold against small arms, but a direct hit from an RPG? Jack nodded, understanding the implication. The cartel was escalating, bringing in weapons capable of neutralizing their carefully prepared defenses. All positions be advised, he broadcast over the comm. Confirm rocket launcher in enemy possession. Prepare for possible explosive impacts. Priority is identifying and neutralizing the launcher before they can deploy effectively. Even as he spoke, Jack was formulating a new defensive strategy. The presence of the RPG meant they could no longer rely solely on fixed positions. They would need to become more mobile, more unpredictable in their defense. Doc, do you have a shot on the rocket team? Negative, came the frustrated reply. They're keeping it well shielded by vehicles and personnel. Would need them to move into the open for a clean shot. Jack considered their options. Direct fire wasn't possible, and their remaining explosives were positioned for defensive purposes rather than offensive strikes at that distance. We need to draw them in, he decided. Make them think they found a vulnerability. Fake a withdrawal? Bulldog suggested over the comm. Exactly. Make them believe position 3 has been abandoned. When they move to exploit, we hit them from multiple angles simultaneously. The cartel forces were indeed preparing for another assault. Jack could see them organizing into fire teams, with the rocket launcher positioned centrally, protected by their best operators. They had learned from their initial failure, adjusting their tactics based on the resistance encountered. They're moving again, Doc reported, more spread out this time, using micro-terrain for cover. These guys definitely have military training. Jack watched through his night vision as the cartel forces began their second major push, advancing in small teams across the western approach. They moved more deliberately this time, each team covering the others, presenting much smaller targets than in their initial assault. Hold fire until they commit, Jack instructed. Let them think their new approach is working. The defenders maintained discipline, allowing the cartel teams to advance to within 200 yards before Position 3 initiated the the planned withdrawal, firing sporadically as if covering a retreat. "They're taking the bait," Bulldog reported. 3 teams converging on position 3. Rocket team moving up in support. Jack waited until the cartel forces had fully committed to the perceived opening, then gave the command. "All positions execute crossfire plan Delta." Now, what had appeared to be an abandoned defensive position suddenly erupted with renewed fire as hidden defenders revealed themselves. Simultaneously, positions 2 and 4 opened up from the flanks, catching the advancing cartel teams in a devastating crossfire. The rocket team, now exposed as they moved to support the assault, presented Doc with the opportunity he had been waiting for. His sniper rifle cracked once, twice, and the 2 men carrying the launcher crumpled to the ground. A 3rd shot eliminated the cartel operator who attempted to retrieve the weapon. "Rocket team down," Doc confirmed with professional satisfaction. For several chaotic minutes, the cartel assault disintegrated under the coordinated defensive fire. Teams that had been advancing confidently found themselves caught in kill zones with fire coming from multiple directions. Those who attempted to retreat faced equally deadly fire from positions they hadn't even identified. "They're breaking," Bulldog called, the excitement evident in his voice. Eastern teams pulling back to vehicles, Western assault collapsing. Jack watched through his night vision as the cartel forces began a disorganized withdrawal, their coordinated tactics breaking down under the pressure of unexpected resistance and mounting casualties. Vehicle engines roared to life as those still mobile attempted to extract their wounded comrades. "Preacher, execute your remaining packages," Jack ordered. "Target their extraction routes, not the vehicles themselves." Executing. The remaining remote charges detonated strategically, not to maximize casualties, but to create obstacles along the most direct evacuation routes. The message was clear. Retreat was being permitted, but not easily. For 15 tense minutes, the defenders maintained disciplined fire as the cartel forces completed their withdrawal. Gradually, the sounds of gunfire diminished, then ceased entirely as the last of the cartel vehicles disappeared into the darkness, carrying their wounded and whatever dead they had been able to recover. "All positions, maintain vigilance," Jack instructed, unwilling to assume the threat had fully passed. "They may be regrouping for another attempt." But as minutes stretched into an hour with no sign of renewed activity, it became increasingly clear that the cartel had indeed broken off their assault. Sheriff Mike's radio crackled with reports from his deputies, who had established checkpoints on nearby roads. "They're confirming multiple vehicles heading south at high speed," Mike reported. "Looks like they're making a run for the border." A cautious sense of victory began to spread among the defenders as the reality set in. They had successfully repelled what had clearly been the cartel's major effort to overwhelm them. The cost had been significant. 3 defenders seriously wounded, several others with minor injuries and substantial damage to portions of the ranch. But they had held. Jack ordered a careful rotation of defenders to allow rest while maintaining vigilance against the possibility of a return. Medical treatment for the wounded continued under Doc's supervision, with the most serious cases prepared for evacuation to proper medical facilities once security could be confirmed. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Jack found himself standing on his porch, surveying the battlefield that had once been his peaceful ranch. Shell casings glinted in the growing light. Impact craters marked where explosives had detonated, and the charred remains of vehicles dotted the landscape. Bulldog joined him, his weathered face showing the fatigue of the night's battle, but his eyes reflecting the same sense of grim satisfaction that Jack felt. "Just like old times," Bulldog remarked, echoing his words from days earlier. Jack nodded slowly. "Except this time, we were fighting for our own ground, not someone else's." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, veterans of countless battles now processing the aftermath of what might well have been their last. "Think they'll be back?" Bulldog finally asked. Jack considered the question carefully before responding. "Not like this. They've lost too many men, too much equipment, and they've learned we're not an easy target." He paused, gazing at the lightening horizon. "They might try something more subtle next time. A sniper maybe, or something that looks like an accident. So we stay vigilant," Bulldog concluded. "We stay vigilant," Jack agreed. As the sun crept above the horizon, painting the desert in hues of gold and amber, Jack thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. From young soldier to veteran commander to retired rancher, and now to this, defender of his home against forces that would have taken it by violence. Margaret would have understood, he thought. She had always understood the warrior in him, even as she helped nurture the man who sought peace. This battle hadn't been a rejection of that peace, but its ultimate defense, standing against those who would destroy it through intimidation and force. Sheriff Mike approached, his uniform dusty and his expression weary but determined. "My deputies have secured the perimeter. State police are 20 minutes out. We've got medics incoming for the wounded." Jack nodded his thanks. "Any word on cartel movement?" "Border Patrol reports increased activity heading south. Looks like they're pulling back completely, at least for now." Mike hesitated, then added, "This isn't over, you know. The cartel doesn't forget." "Neither do we," Bulldog interjected. Mike studied them both, then shook his head with a mixture of respect and exasperation. "You know, when I first heard about 4 old vets planning to take on the Escobar cartel, I thought you were suicidal. Now," he gestured at the evidence of the night's successful defense, "now I'm thinking the cartel might want to reconsider their expansion plans." Jack allowed himself a small smile. That was the idea. As the sun climbed higher, bringing full daylight to the battlefield, Jack felt a complex mixture of emotions: satisfaction at having defended what was his, sorrow for the injuries sustained by those who had stood with him, uncertainty about what might come next. But stronger than all of these was a sense of rightness, of having faced a challenge that demanded a response and having met it with courage and determination. He had not run, had not surrendered what was his to those who would take it by force. And in that, perhaps, was the lesson of his long life, that some things were worth fighting for, worth risking everything to defend. His home, his principles, the peace he had earned through decades of service. The cartel had learned that lesson the hard way. Jack Holliday might be an old man, but he was an old man with skills, with friends, and with an unwavering determination to protect what was his. As Doc and Preacher joined them on the porch, the 4 veterans stood together in the morning light, battered but unbowed, having faced one last battle together and emerged victorious. The storm had come as they had known it would, and they had weathered it as they had always done before. 3 months after the battle that locals had taken to calling the siege at Holiday Ranch, Jack sat on his newly rebuilt porch, watching the sunset paint the desert landscape in familiar hues of gold and crimson. The physical scars of the confrontation had largely been erased, bullet holes patched, damaged structures repaired, the landscape restored to its former tranquility. But the memory remained, as did the changes it had wrought, both to the property and to Jack himself. The ranch was different now, its peaceful appearance concealing significant security enhancements that remained in place. Preacher's electronic early warning system had been permanently installed, providing continuous monitoring of the property perimeter. Reinforced walls and defensive positions had been camouflaged, but maintained, ready if ever needed again. Jack's home remained a sanctuary, but it was now a sanctuary prepared to defend itself. The community had changed as well. What had begun as volunteers helping a neighbor had evolved into something more enduring, a network of mutual support and vigilance that extended throughout the county. Regular gatherings at Jack's ranch had become a tradition, bringing together veterans, law enforcement, and civilians united by their shared experience and commitment to protecting their way of life. The cartel, as predicted, had not returned in force. Border Patrol and DEA operations, fueled by intelligence gathered during the battle and subsequent investigations, had severely disrupted the Escobar organization's activities in the region. Javier Escobar remained in federal custody, his operation fractured, his family's influence diminished though not eliminated. There had been probes, suspicious vehicles observed near the property, reports of cartel associates asking questions in nearby towns, a single aborted attempt by what appeared to be a reconnaissance team that retreated quickly when detected by the perimeter security system. But no direct confrontation had materialized. Jack took a sip from his coffee mug, savoring the peaceful moment while maintaining the habitual awareness that had become second nature over decades of service and now seemed permanently reactivated. Some instincts, once reawakened, never truly slept again. The sound of approaching vehicles drew his attention. 3 motorcycles appeared on the horizon, following the winding access road toward the ranch. Jack smiled in recognition, setting his coffee aside and rising to greet his visitors. Bulldog, Doc, and Preacher arrived in a cloud of dust, their machines roaring to a stop in the yard. All 3 had returned to their respective homes after the battle, once it became clear that the immediate threat had passed. But they had remained in constant contact, and their periodic reunions at the ranch had become a cherished ritual. Right on time, Jack called as they dismounted. Steaks are already marinating. Greetings were exchanged, the warmth of decades-long friendship evident in every handshake and embrace. They gathered on the porch, Bulldog distributing beers from the cooler he'd strapped to his motorcycle, Doc retrieving the chess set that had become a fixture of their gatherings, Preacher producing a bag of fresh peppers from his garden for the promised meal. "How's the knee?" Doc asked Jack, his physician's eye noting the slight stiffness in Jack's movement. "Same as always," Jack replied with a shrug. Reminds me it's there when the weather changes." Doc nodded, accepting the non-answer with the understanding of a friend who knew when not to press. "And the property? Any more unwanted visitors?" "Nothing direct," Jack said. "Sheriff Mike reports rumors of cartel interests shifting farther west. Seems they've decided there are easier territories to expand into." "Can't imagine why," Bulldog remarked dryly, drawing chuckles from the others. They settled into comfortable conversation, updating each other on their lives, reminiscing about shared experiences, occasionally circling back to the battle that had brought them together one last time. The chess game progressed between Doc and Preacher, with Jack and Bulldog offering unsolicited and largely ignored advice from the sidelines. As sunset gave way to twilight, Jack fired up the grill, the familiar ritual of preparing a meal for his oldest friends, bringing a contentment that seemed to settle deeper with each passing year. The steak dinner that followed was enjoyed with the appreciation of men who had known hunger in their lives, who understood that simple pleasures were often the most profound. Later, as stars began to emerge in the desert sky, they sat around the fire pit in Jack's yard, the conversation turning reflective, as it often did in these evening hours. "You know," Preacher said thoughtfully, gazing into the dancing flames, "I've been thinking about why we did this, why we came back, took on a cartel at our age." "Because Jack asked," Bulldog replied simply, as if that explained everything. And in many ways it did. The bond between them transcended time and distance, a brotherhood forged in circumstances few could understand and tested in ways fewer still had experienced. "More than that," Doc suggested. "It was about standing for something, about not backing down when it would have been easier to walk away." Jack listened silently, his gaze fixed on the fire. He had asked himself the same question many times in the months since the battle. Why had he chosen to fight when selling the property would have been simpler, safer? Why had his friends responded so unhesitatingly to his call? "I think," he said finally, "it was about remembering who we are, at our core, beyond the years and the miles and the changes life brings. About honoring not just what we've done, but what we stand for." The others nodded in understanding. "And what about now?" Preacher asked, looking around at the peaceful ranch. "What comes next for Captain Jack Holliday?" Jack smiled, his weathered face illuminated by the firelight. "This," he said simply, gesturing to the gathering. "This moment. These connections. Learning to appreciate the peace because we've known the alternative." He reached into his pocket and withdrew 4 tarnished coins, the same Special Forces Challenge coins he had distributed before the battle. Solemnly, he handed one to each of his friends, keeping the 4th for himself. "Margaret always said I'd never really retire," Jack continued, his voice softening at the mention of his late wife. "Said the warrior was too much a part of who I am." He turned the coin over in his fingers, the firelight catching on its embossed surface. "But she also believed that fighting was only worthwhile if you knew what you were fighting for." "To Margaret," Doc said, raising his beer in tribute. "The wisest of us all?" "To Margaret," the others echoed. They sat in companionable silence for a time, each man lost in his own thoughts yet connected by the invisible threads of shared experience and mutual understanding. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling upward to join the stars. "There's a question I've been meaning to ask," Bulldog said eventually. "That moment when Escobar first came to the ranch before you called us, were you scared, Jack?" Jack considered the question seriously, respecting its intent. "Not scared exactly. More awakened. Like something long dormant was suddenly stirring." He looked around at his friends, these men who had answered his call without hesitation. "I knew I wasn't alone even before you arrived. I knew who I was, who we all are." Bulldog nodded, satisfied with the answer. "Once a warrior," he said, not needing to complete the phrase they all knew. "Always a warrior," the others responded in unison. In the distance, a coyote called, its plaintive howl carried on the night breeze. The desert stretched away in all directions, vast and ancient, indifferent to the small circle of light and humanity in its midst. Yet within that circle, something profound and enduring had been reaffirmed. A brotherhood that transcended time and distance. a commitment to standing together against whatever threats might come. Jack Holliday looked around at his oldest friends, these men who had stood with him from jungles to deserts to this final battleground of his own making. In their weathered faces, he saw the young soldiers they had once been, the seasoned warriors they had become, and the steadfast brothers they would always remain. They had faced the storm together one last time, and though their fighting days might truly be behind them now, the bond forged in combat and tempered by time remained unbreakable. As the fire burned lower and the night deepened, Jack felt a sense of completion, of having come full circle. He had defended his home, protected his community, and most importantly, honored the principles that had guided his life. Some men spent their twilight years wondering if they still mattered, if they could still make a difference in a world that seemed to have moved beyond them. Jack Holliday had no such doubts, nor did the three men who sat with him around the dying fire. These brothers who had answered when called, who had stood their ground against overwhelming odds, who had proven that age was no barrier to courage or commitment. The old warriors had tapped into something timeless, the understanding that some things were worth fighting for, and that standing together in defense of those things was perhaps the most profound expression of brotherhood there was. As midnight approached and conversation gave way to comfortable silence, Jack looked up at the star-filled sky, feeling a deep contentment that had eluded him since Margaret's passing. She would have understood what had happened here, what had been reclaimed and reaffirmed. In defending his home, Jack Holliday had found his peace again. And in the company of his oldest friends, he had rediscovered the brotherhood that had defined his life. Some would call it their last battle. Jack preferred to think of it as their finest hour. And as the fire burned down to embers and the desert night wrapped around them like a familiar blanket, the four old warriors sat together in silence, bound by memories of battles past and the quiet triumph of having faced one final storm, together as they had always been.